The medieval world was not kind to kingdoms. Most did not survive it. Empires fractured. Cities emptied. Dynasties vanished without leaving names behind. And yet, on a wet island at the edge of Europe, power did not disappear. It reorganized. Why did Britain endure when so many others collapsed? For centuries, invasion followed invasion. Roman authority fell away. New peoples crossed the sea. Plague returned again and again. Civil war became routine. And still, the island held. The usual story describes medieval Britain as a long night of ignorance and violence. A time of disorder between better ages. That picture is incomplete. This was not only an age of collapse, it was an age of construction. Under constant pressure, Britain learned how to survive without certainty, how to rule without stability, how to extract loyalty, food, and labor from fractured societies. Slowly, imperfectly, systems emerged. Law hardened. Land became power. The church carried memory when institutions failed. Violence was contained, not eliminated. These were not accidents. They were responsive. This is not a story of heroes or crowns. It is a story of adaptation. From the moment Roman control dissolved, Britain was forced to solve problems that would never fully go away. Who owns land? Who commands loyalty? Who enforces order when authority is fragile? The answers changed over time. But each solution left a trace. From the ruins of Rome to the threshold of the modern world, medieval Britain became a laboratory of survival. What formed here would outlast the age itself. The systems built under medieval pressure did not vanish. They carried forward, and they would shape everything that followed. Rome did not fall in Britain with fire and shouting. It faded. At the beginning of the 5th century, there was no single day when Roman rule ended. No final battle. No formal goodbye. There was only absence. For nearly 400 years, Britain had existed inside a vast imperial system. Not just ruled by Rome, but sustained by it. Money moved along roads built to last centuries. Grain traveled from field to fortress. Orders arrived written in Latin, stamped with authority that needed no explanation. Rome did not simply govern Britain, it organized it. When that organization weakened, nothing rushed in to replace it. At first, life appeared unchanged. The towns still stood. The villas still functioned. Markets still opened. But beneath the surface, connections were breaking. Roman Britain had always depended on what lay beyond the island. Troops were recruited elsewhere. Officials rotated in and out. Coinage arrived from imperial mints. Security depended on legions whose loyalty was owed not to Britain, but to Rome. When pressure mounted across the empire in the Rhine, the Danube, and in Italy itself, Britain slipped from priority to liability. Rome needed soldiers closer to home. Units were withdrawn quietly. Some never returned from leave. Others were reassigned and not replaced. Forts remained, but garrisons thinned. Pay arrived late, then not at all. Authority weakened first at the edges, then at the center. For generations, Roman administration had provided predictability. Taxes were demanded, but roads existed to carry goods. Law was enforced, but disputes followed recognizable rules. Violence existed, but it was regulated. Now, that predictability dissolved. When the central government stopped responding, local officials were left exposed. A tax collector without an army was not authority. He was a target. Gradually, civic life became dangerous. Town councils that once organized public works began to fail. Bathhouses fell into disrepair. Stone buildings cracked and were not repaired. Roofs collapsed and were not replaced. Urban life depends on surplus and coordination. Both were vanishing. The Roman town was not a natural British settlement. It was an imported structure, maintained by imperial systems. When those systems broke, towns lost their reason to exist. People did not flee in panic. They drifted. A family moved closer to land it could control. A craftsman returned to farming. Merchants stopped traveling when roads were no longer safe. The roads themselves still lay across the landscape, straight, stone-based, engineered for movement. But roads are only useful if someone guarantees safety along them. Without patrols, movement became risk. Banditry increased, not because society collapsed, but because enforcement vanished. Old grudges returned. Private protection replaced public law. Security became personal again. In this environment, power did not disappear. It fragmented. Roman Britain had trained local elites to govern on Rome's behalf. Landowners collected taxes. Officials administered justice. Military commanders maintained order. When imperial authority withdrew, these figures remained. But now, they acted alone. Some attempted to preserve Roman structures. They maintained Latin titles. They issued orders in familiar forms. They hoped Rome would return. Others adapted faster. They fortified estates. They gathered followers. They relied on kinship and loyalty rather than law. This was not rebellion. It was survival. Without centralized authority, Britain did not become chaotic overnight. It became local. Power shrank to the distance a man could enforce it. A day's ride, a valley, a coastline. Beyond that, promises meant little. The countryside absorbed people the way cities once had. Small farms multiplied. Mixed agriculture replaced market specialization. Families produced what they needed because exchange was unreliable. This was not a return to pre-Roman life. It was something new. Roman techniques, persistent field systems, tools, habits of record-keeping. But they operated without imperial scale. Britain was learning how to exist without a center. Religion, too, adapted. Christianity had spread through Roman networks. Churches clustered in towns. Bishops traveled on imperial roads. As towns weakened, the church followed the population outward. Faith did not disappear. It decentralized. Local leaders gained religious authority alongside social power. Memory replaced documentation. Tradition replaced instruction. The past still mattered, but it was no longer enforced. Across the island, communication slowed. News traveled late or not at all. Decisions were made without knowing what others would do. This uncertainty changed behavior. Defensive structures multiplied. Hilltops were reused. Old fortifications regained meaning. The landscape began to shape power again. In Roman Britain, geographies had been mastered. Roads ignored rivers and ridges. Movement obeyed engineering. Now, geography reasserted itself. Valleys became worlds. Marshes became borders. Forests protected those who knew them. Britain did not fall apart. It broke into pieces that made sense locally. Along the coasts, danger arrived first. Without a navy to patrol the seas, Britain's shoreline was exposed. Raids increased, not invasions yet, but pressure. Communities responded by pulling inward. Settlements shifted away from open coasts. Watchfulness became routine. Fear became practical. In the absence of Rome, leadership changed its nature. It was no longer about office. It was about protection. A leader was someone who could keep food stored, followers armed, and rivals at bay. Titles mattered less than outcomes. This was a dangerous transformation. When authority becomes personal, it becomes fragile. When loyalty replaces law, conflict becomes permanent. Britain entered a long negotiation with instability. Yet even now, continuity persisted. Roman identity did not vanish overnight. People still thought of themselves as Roman. Latin remained in use. Old customs lingered. But identity without structure is memory. And memory fades. Children born in this period did not experience Roman order. They inherited its remnants without understanding its origins. For them, roads were simply old paths. Stone buildings were ruins. Coins became ornaments. Meaning shifted. As imperial time dissolved, local time took its place. Seasons mattered more than calendars. Harvests mattered more than proclamations. Britain learned to live without synchronization. This slow fragmentation was not unique. It was happening across the Western Empire. But Britain's isolation intensified it. When Rome weakened elsewhere, neighboring provinces could lean on each other. Britain had the sea. The same water that once protected it now separated it from recovery. Appeals for help went unanswered. Messages vanished into distance. Britain was alone. And yet, this isolation forced adaptation. Without external rescue, solutions had to be internal. Communities experimented. Some failed. Some endured. Power settled into hands that could hold it. What emerged was not a vacuum, but a field of competing authorities. Small, resilient, and unstable. This environment rewarded flexibility over legitimacy. Those who clung too tightly to Roman forms weakened. Those who adjusted survived. But survival carried a cost. Without coordination, Britain lost scale. Without scale, it lost protection. Without protection, it became vulnerable. The systems Rome had provided, taxation, defense, law, had not been replaced. They had been broken down into fragments. Each fragment functioned locally. None functioned nationally. Britain was no longer a province. It was a patchwork, and patchworks invite pressure. Across the sea, others were watching. They saw empty forts, unprotected coasts. Wealth without defense. Movement would follow. The collapse of Roman Britain did not create a dark age. It created a testing ground. The island had learned how to live without an empire. It had not yet learned how to defend itself without one. That lesson was coming. The fragmentation that allowed survival would soon invite challenge, and the answers Britain found next would reshape the island forever. The balance it had reached was temporary. The next chapter would test whether Britain's adaptations were enough. By the middle of the 5th century, the absence of Rome was no longer theoretical. It was felt daily. What had once been delayed became impossible. Repairs were postponed until they stopped happening at all. Orders were issued that no one enforced. Taxes were demanded that no one collected. The administration depends on expectation. When people no longer believe a system will respond, they stop participating in it. This was the quiet end of Roman governance. Across Britain, the machinery of empire stood idle, not destroyed, simply unused. Records were no longer updated. Courts no longer convened regularly. Officials stopped traveling. The system did not collapse under attack. It collapsed from stillness. Roman roads, once the arteries of the province, began to fail, not because they were poorly built, but because they were no longer maintained. Drainage clogged. Surfaces cracked. Bridges weakened. A road that cannot be trusted becomes a risk. Merchants adjusted first. They shortened routes. They avoided long-distance travel. They traded locally, where reputation offered more security than law. Once trade contracts, towns lose purpose. Urban life is an agreement. People live close together because systems support density, water, food supply, security, waste removal. When those systems fail, proximity becomes danger. Disease spreads faster. Food shortages bite harder. Conflict escalates quickly. Families moved outward, not in fear, but in calculation. A farm could feed a household. A town could not. Once supply chains broke, as populations thinned, urban space transformed. Public buildings were reused as housing. Stone was stripped for walls and barns. Monuments became quarries. This was not vandalism, it was practical. Roman architecture had been built for permanence. Post-Roman life demanded flexibility. The forum lost meaning. The villa survived. Large estates became the new centers of power, not because they were political, but because they were productive. Land mattered more than office. Food mattered more than law. Those who controlled surplus controlled loyalty. This shift altered social relationships. Under Rome, status came from connection to authority. Now, it came from access to resources. Dependence replaced citizenship. Free farmers sought protection. Laborers attached themselves to estates. Security was exchanged for obedience. This was not feudalism yet, but the logic was forming. In the absence of centralized authority, Britain did not become equal. It became uneven. Some regions adapted better than others. Fertile lowlands sustained population. Marginal lands emptied. Power clustered where survival was easiest. Communication between regions became sporadic. What one area experienced did not necessarily affect another. Time itself fragmented. A crisis in the West might be unknown, in the East, for months, or forever. This isolation hardened differences. Languages shifted, customs diverged, local identities strengthened. The idea of Britain weakened, not as a name, but as a lived reality. People belonged to places they could see. Military organization followed the same pattern. Roman Britain had relied on professional soldiers paid by the state. Without pay, armies dissolved. Some veterans stayed, others left. Many adapted. Weapons became personal possessions, not state property. Defense became local responsibility. Communities organized what chase. Leaders gathered retainers. Conflict became small-scale but constant. Raids replaced campaigns. Feuds replaced wars. Violence did not increase dramatically. It became normalized. Justice, too, changed form. Roman law required records, courts, and enforcement. None of these could function reliably anymore. Disputes were settled by negotiation, threat, or compensation. Wrongdoing was addressed by families, not institutions. This made justice immediate and unstable. What mattered was not what was right, but what could be enforced. Religion offered continuity where administration failed. Christianity survived because it required little infrastructure. It moved through memory, ritual, and repetition. Church leaders became anchors of stability, because they were powerful, but because they were predictable. They remembered the past when others forgot it, but even the church adapted. Without state support, it became local. Authority rested on persuasion, not hierarchy. Unity weakened. Britain was not abandoning Rome, it was outgrowing it under pressure. The Roman world had trained people to think in systems. Now they were forced to operate without them. This produced innovation, but also loss. Knowledge narrowed. Skills that depended on scale disappeared. Craft specialization declined. Not because people forgot how, because demand vanished. You do not build aqueducts for villages. You do not mint coins for barter economies. Money itself changed meaning. Coins stopped circulating. Not immediately, but gradually. Without taxation and salaries, coinage lost purpose. It became stored, hoarded, or worn as jewelry. Value shifted from abstract measurement to tangible goods. Grain, livestock, land. This made wealth visible and vulnerable. Raiding became profitable. Britain's fragmentation created opportunity. Across the North Sea, communities faced pressure of their own. Population growth, limited land, political competition. They looked outward. What they saw was an island, no longer defended by an empire, not empty, but exposed. This pressure did not arrive as conquest at first. It arrived as contact, trade, seasonal movement, settlement at the margins. Britain's local leaders responded unevenly. Some resisted, some negotiated. Some invited newcomers as allies. Without a central authority, there was no unified response. Each decision solved an immediate problem. Each created long-term consequences. This is how fragmentation deepens. By the end of the 5th century, Roman Britain existed only as memory, not erased, but irrelevant. The structures it had relied upon were gone. The habits remained but without coordination. Britain had survived the withdrawal of Rome. That alone was an achievement. But survival is not stability. The island had learned how to live without empire. It had not learned how to prevent replacement. The vacuum Rome left behind was not empty. It was contested. Local power could manage scarcity. It could not manage migration, competition, and expansion. The slow collapse had produced resilience. It had also produced weakness. Britain stood divided, localized, and exposed. What came next would not destroy what remained. It would build upon it. New powers would not arrive to erase the past. They would insert themselves into its fractures. The fragmentation that saved Britain from sudden collapse now defined its future. The next chapter would show what happens when outsiders enter a landscape already broken into pieces, and how Britain's slow fall made conquest possible. When Rome faded from Britain, it did not leave silence behind. It left space. Across the North Sea, communities were already moving, not armies. Families, they came in small numbers at first. By boat, by season, by opportunity, Angles, Saxons, Jutes. They did not arrive to conquer a nation. There was no nation left to conquer. They arrived in a landscape without coordination. Britain's coasts were long and exposed. Its defenses were local. Its leadership fragmented. What the newcomers encountered was not emptiness, but weakness in heaven, negotiable and open to pressure. At first, these movements looked temporary. Seasonal settlement, trade, raiding, followed by retreat. But movement has momentum. Some stayed, some returned with others. Children were born. Presence became permanence. This was not a single migration, it was a process. And it unfolded slowly enough to reshape society from the inside. The newcomers did not rebuild Roman towns, they avoided them. Urban ruins were symbols of a system that no longer worked. Stone walls could not feed people. Empty streets offered no protection. Instead, settlement followed land. Rivers, valleys, arable soil, small villages emerged clusters of wooden buildings, easily rebuilt, close to fields and pasture. This was a different way of living. Roman Britain had been organized around administration. Anglo-Saxon Britain organized itself around households. The basic unit of power was no longer the city. It was the hall. A hall was not just a building. It was a center of obligation. Here, a leader offered food, protection, and gifts. In return, followers offered labor, loyalty, and arms. Power was personal. It depended on reputation, on generosity, on the ability to reward service. A leader who failed to provide lost followers. A follower who broke loyalty lost protection. This system was flexible and fragile. Kinship mattered more than territory. Family ties defined obligation. Disputes were remembered across generations. Law did not vanish. It transformed. Roman law required documents and enforcement. Anglo-Saxon law lived in memory. Custom determined right and wrong. Justice was negotiated. Compensation replaced punishment. A killing did not automatically demand execution. It demanded payment. The value of a life was measured in silver, cattle, or land, not equally. Status mattered. This was not mercy. It was containment. Revenge could spiral endlessly. Compensation stopped the cycle if it was accepted. Law, in this world, was not about morality. It was about preventing chaos. Violence was expected. Its spread was managed. Religion reflected the same logic. The early Anglo-Saxon world was pagan and chaotic, but practical. Gods were close. Local, connected to land, harvest, war, and weather. Belief was not centralized. It varied from place to place. Ritual mattered more than doctrine. Participation mattered more than belief. Christianity did not disappear after Rome, but it retreated. In some regions, Christian communities survived quietly. In others, they faded. When Christianity returned, it did so slowly, and it adapted. Missionaries did not arrive to destroy local systems. They attached themselves to them. Kings converted first not from faith alone, but from calculation. Christianity offered something valuable: connection. It linked rulers to wider networks across seas. Across cultures, it offered literacy, legitimacy, and memory. But conversion did not erase the old world overnight. Pagan practice continued. Christian symbols blended with older customs. Belief changed by layering, not replacement. Power during this period did not consolidate quickly. It multiplied. Small kingdoms emerged, fluid, unstable, overlapping. Boundaries shifted with marriages, battles, and alliances. Kings ruled people, not land. Authority extended as far as loyalty held. This made leadership adaptive. A strong leader could gather followers rapidly. A weak one vanished just as fast. There was no permanence, and yet, something new was forming. The absence of empire allowed experimentation. Different regions developed different solutions. Some emphasized kinship, others emphasized territory. Some relied on violence, others on negotiation. Over time, patterns emerged. Kingship hardened. Not into centralized rule, but into expectation. A king was no longer just a successful war leader. He became a focal point, a distributor of justice, a guardian of custom, a broker between gods and people. This was power with limits. A king who ignored custom lost legitimacy. A king who failed to reward followers lost authority. There were no institutions to protect him. The land itself shaped outcomes. Dense forests slowed movement. Rivers guided settlement. Marshes protected borders. Geography fragmented Britain further, but also stabilized local power. What worked in one region failed in another. Unity was impossible. Adaptation was mandatory. Trade returned gradually, not at Roman scale, but enough. Goods moved along rivers and coasts. Luxury items signaled status. Gift exchange reinforced loyalty. Economy served politics. Memory became history. Stories replaced records. Lineage replaced documentation. The past mattered, but only as it could be remembered. This created a different relationship with time. Roman Britain had lived inside a continuous present, anchored by empire. Anglo-Saxon Britain lived inside cycles: season, feast, war, settlement. Life was repetitive. Change was gradual, and yet irreversible. By the 7th century, Britain was no longer Roman in practice or identity, but it was not unified either. It was a mosaic of local powers, resilient, adaptable, and divided. The vacuum Rome left behind had been filled, not by another empire, but by many small worlds. This system could absorb pressure. It could survive loss, but it could not coordinate. Power had become local, personal, and flexible. That flexibility ensured survival. It also ensured conflict, because what holds together locally often breaks apart collectively. The solutions Britain found in this age solved immediate problems. They did not create lasting unity. That tension would remain, and it would define what came next. Because as these local worlds hardened, they began to collide. The balance they had found would not last. The next chapter would reveal what happens when flexible power meets ambition and when small kingdoms begin to test the limits of their own survival. As generations passed, temporary arrangements became inherited realities. Children born into this world did not remember Roman order. They inherited something else entirely. Village life was no longer an adaptation. It was the norm. Settlements were small by design, not because people feared growth, but because growth required coordination they did not have. A village functioned because everyone knew everyone else. Obligation was visible. Reputation mattered. Land was held through use, not documentation. Boundaries were remembered, not surveyed. This made ownership flexible and contested. Disputes over land were common. They were settled by elders, assemblies, or force, often all three. The hall remained central. It was where food was shared, where disputes were addressed, where alliances were declared. But it was also where power was displayed. A leader's strength was measured by attendance. A full hall meant loyalty. An empty one meant danger. Gift-giving was not generosity. It was investment. Weapons, ornaments, livestock, these were tools of governance. They bound followers to leaders. Warrior culture emerged from this environment. Not as constant warfare, but as readiness. Men trained because violence could arrive without warning. Defense was communal responsibility. Honor mattered because reputation protected you when institutions did not. This culture did not glorify chaos, it managed it. The expectation of violence made restraint meaningful. Law evolved accordingly. Assemblies gathered at known places. Decisions were made publicly. Justice depended on memory. Witnesses mattered more than evidence. Compensation systems became increasingly formal, not written, but standardized. The value of injury was known. The price of death was calculated. This prevented escalation. But it also reinforced hierarchy. The higher one's status, the higher the compensation. Equality was not a goal. Stability was. Women occupied complex positions within this system. They were not absent from power, but their authority operated differently. Marriage forged alliances. Inheritance carried obligation. Kinship ran through both lines. This made family networks dense and conflict personal. Religion continued to adapt. Pagan practice remained dominant in many regions. But Christianity returned with persistence. Missionaries learned quickly. They did not challenge halls. They entered them. Conversion followed power. When a leader adopted Christianity, his followers often followed, not out of belief, but loyalty. Christianity reshaped kingship subtly. It introduced ideas of sacred authority, of moral judgment beyond kinship. It also introduced writing. Memory slowly gained a new anchor. Monasteries became centers of learning, not immediately, but gradually. They preserved names, they preserved lineages, they preserved claims. This changed how power justified itself. A king could now point to God, not just followers. But this authority was still negotiated. A Christian king who failed in war lost support as quickly as a pagan one. Faith did not replace force, it reframed it. As kingdoms grew, flexibility met strain. Small-scale leadership worked in villages. It strained across regions. Rulers attempted new solutions. Some delegated power to trusted kin, others enforced tribute. Control became uneven. This created internal tension. Followers demanded protection. Leaders demanded loyalty. When either failed, fragmentation followed. Conflict between kingdoms increased. Not as grand wars, but as continuous pressure. Borders shifted, alliances changed. Survival favored those who adapted fastest. Some kingdoms absorbed others. Some disappeared, but even expansion had limits. Without centralized administration, growth produced instability. Power remained personal. A strong ruler could unify briefly. His death dissolved unity. Succession was dangerous. Kinship offered claim, but not guarantee. Violence often followed. This instability was not failure, it was structural. The system rewarded adaptability over permanence. Britain was becoming accustomed to change. Trade networks expanded slowly, not enough to create cities, enough to connect elites. Luxury goods traveled. Symbols of status circulated. This reinforced hierarchy. Economic difference became visible, but the economy remained local. Most people lived close to subsistence. Surplus was rare and powerful. This kept authority grounded. Kings could not rule without consent. Not ideological consent, but practical. If people left, authority vanished. Geography continued to limit ambition. Forests broke armies. Rivers defined movement. Control required presence. This prevented empire. It enabled endurance. By the late 7th century, Britain was stable in its instability. Local systems worked. People knew how to live without certainty, how to adapt quickly, how to negotiate power. This resilience was hard-won, but it came at a cost. Without coordination, Britain remained vulnerable to external pressure. Without unity, responses were fragmented. The very flexibility that ensured survival prevented consolidation. Power could bend, it could not bind. This contradiction would shape the future. The Anglo-Saxon world had filled Rome's vacuum. It had not replaced Rome's reach. It created societies that could endure stress, not ones that could prevent it. The systems built here would survive for centuries. They would also invite challenge. Because local power works until something larger arrives, and something always does. The balance these societies achieved solved immediate problems. It postponed deeper ones. The next chapter would confront the consequences of flexibility when ambition grows and when power begins to harden into something less forgiving. The balance they lived with would not last. As the 7th century advanced, memory itself began to change shape. What had once been lived experience became inheritance. Stories hardened into expectation. Custom settled into habit. The Anglo-Saxon world was no longer forming. It was settling. Power, once improvised, began to recognize its own patterns. People now expected certain things from leaders. Protection, judgment, distribution. Failure carried consequences. This expectation marked a quiet transformation. Leadership was no longer temporary success. It became responsibility. Villages remained small, but relationships stretched farther. Marriage connected families across regions. Alliances crossed rivers and forests. Kinship networks widened. With them, obligation. This expansion changed conflict. Disputes were no longer always local. A single insult could draw in extended families. Feuds widened. The compensation system strained. What worked within a village faltered across regions. Payment became harder to enforce. Acceptance less certain. Violence threatened to escape containment. Assemblies adapted. Larger gatherings formed. Multiple communities met to negotiate disputes. This was not government, but it was coordination. Consensus replaced command. These gatherings reinforced hierarchy. Those who spoke carried weight. Those who mediated gained authority. Leadership became less physical, more persuasive. Words mattered. This shift favored certain individuals. Those with lineage, those with reputation, those with access to Christian learning. Literacy, rare as it was, became power. Christianity deepened its influence here. Monasteries multiplied. Not everywhere, but enough. They acted as anchors. They preserved agreements. They recorded donations. They remembered who owed whom. This changed how power justified itself. Claims were no longer only spoken. They were remembered beyond a single generation. The past became usable. Kings began to understand this. They supported monasteries not from devotion alone, but from strategy. A monastery stabilized territory. It tied land to memory. It created legitimacy. Faith and power intertwined. But belief remained uneven. Pagan practice persisted quietly. Sacred sites endured. Old rituals blended with new ones. Conversion was gradual because identity was layered. People did not replace gods. They added meanings. This adaptability reduced resistance. Change felt familiar. Warrior culture also adjusted. Violence remained expected. But discipline increased. Warbands became more organized. Loyalty sharpened. Weapons symbolized obligation as much as threat. A sword was not just a tool. It was a bond. This increased the cost of betrayal. Kings relied on these bonds to expand influence. But expansion exposed weakness. As authority stretched, personal relationships thinned. Control weakened. Delegation increased risk. Local leaders gained autonomy. Some resisted. Rebellion did not require ideology, only opportunity. This made kingship precarious. A ruler had to balance generosity with control. Force with negotiation. Too harsh, and followers left. Too weak, and rivals rose. There were no institutions to absorb failure. Mistakes were fatal. Geography continued to enforce limits. Dense forests fragmented control. Coasts invited contact. Britain remained open. Across the sea, attention increased, not yet invasion, but awareness. Trade intensified. Ideas moved. Britain was no longer isolated. Its systems were visible. This visibility mattered. Flexible power is effective locally. It is attractive externally. Others recognized its weaknesses. The Anglo-Saxon world had created stability without centralization. It had not created defense against coordinated pressure. Yet internally, identity strengthened. People now identified as belonging to kingdoms. Not Britain, not Rome. Names mattered. These identities created loyalty. They also created rivalry. Competition sharpened ambition. Some rulers began to dream larger. They tested boundaries. They demanded tribute. This marked a turning point. Power was still personal, but it was becoming aspirational. The system resisted this. Local loyalty resisted distant rule. Every attempt at consolidation triggered fragmentation elsewhere. Britain oscillated between unity and division, between ambition and survival. This tension defined the age. By the end of the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxon world had achieved something remarkable. It had replaced empire with endurance. People knew how to live with instability. They knew how to negotiate violence. They knew how to adapt belief and law to circumstance. These were not weak societies. They were resilient ones. But resilience has a limit. It absorbs pressure. It does not remove it. The systems that had grown here solved immediate problems. They postponed larger ones. They created communities capable of survival, not of coordination. This unresolved tension would shape everything that followed, because as ambitions grew, flexibility would be tested. And when power begins to harden, systems built for movement begin to crack. The Anglo-Saxon world was about to face pressures it could not avoid, and the solutions it chose would define the next transformation of Britain. The balance they had learned to live with was no longer enough. The next chapter would ask whether local power could become lasting power, or whether Britain would fragment once again under forces larger than kinship and custom. The 7th century brought more than survival. It brought opportunity. Britain's landscape, fractured and flexible, was now ready for consolidation. The small worlds that had emerged after Rome's withdrawal were beginning to interact. Boundaries that were once fluid began to solidify, if only partially. Power had become personal, but it could also become regional. Out of these conditions, early kingdoms emerged. Northumbria rose in the north, stretching along the fertile valleys and rivers that linked former Roman roads. Mercia claimed the central Midlands, a patchwork of forests and rivers that demanded careful negotiation to control. Wessex grew along the southern plains, consolidating fertile land and coastal access. None of these kingdoms was absolute. None commanded universal obedience. They were collections of loyalties, alliances, and obligations, and they were fragile. Kings did not rule through abstract authority. They ruled by negotiation, by presence, by reputation. A king's hall was both home and center of government. It was where gifts were given, where warriors swore allegiance, where disputes were mediated. Loyalty was earned, not demanded. Generosity reinforced authority. Violence enforced it, but only as a tool, not a constant. Assemblies remained central to governance. They were gatherings of local leaders, elders, and free men. Decisions were debated, custom interpreted, and disputes resolved. A king could command, but he could not decree blindly. Authority relied on consent, often fragile and negotiable. Law codes began to formalize these practices. Early texts, written in Old English and occasionally Latin, recorded customs, compensation rates, and rights. They were not extensive bureaucracies. They were reminders of agreements and obligations. They gave structure to personal power. Christianity played a transformative role. The church offered moral authority and literacy. It provided stability that local loyalties alone could not sustain. Kings adopted Christianity strategically. Conversion was a political act as much as a religious one. A Christian king could claim divine favor. He could summon support across communities. He could record agreements that carried weight beyond oral memory. But Christianity did not replace existing systems. It reinforced them. It worked with, rather than against, kinship and warrior culture. The process of kingdom formation was incremental. It did not occur in sudden conquest. It emerged from negotiation, marriage, tribute, and occasional war. Northumbria grew by linking fertile territories along rivers, absorbing smaller groups into its sphere. Its kings relied on local elites to enforce obligations. They rewarded service with gifts, land, and protection. Those who refused allegiance were excluded or removed. Mercy expended through cautious diplomacy and selective warfare. Its leaders understood the terrain. They exploited rivers, forests, and trade routes to consolidate influence. But power remained personal, dependent on a chain of obligations that could break at any moment. Wessex followed a similar model. Kings negotiated authority with local lords, and sometimes with other kings. Success was measured in loyalty, military victories, and the ability to protect wealth. This was a new era of kingship. Not absolute, not centralized, but resilient. Kings ruled through relationships. They led by example, by presence, by negotiation. Assemblies became arenas where loyalty was tested, where authority was displayed, where law was interpreted and enforced. The king's role was to balance power. Too much force alienated followers. Too little allowed rivals to rise. Gift-giving reinforced bonds. Feasts, weapons, and land were distributed to cement allegiance. A king's generosity was as important as his sword. Christianity strengthened this system. Monks and bishops served as record-keepers and advisors. Churches became centers of communication and legitimacy. Royal charters and donations recorded in monasteries preserved agreements that otherwise might have been forgotten. Faith gave moral weight to authority. A king was not only a warrior or landholder. He was accountable to God and the church. This accountability enhanced loyalty among followers and neighboring kingdoms alike. Conflict remained inevitable. Borders were fluid. Ambition was constant. Success was measured in both defense and expansion. But the structure of authority had changed. Power was no longer arbitrary. It followed negotiation, tradition, and the careful maintenance of alliances. The rise of early kingdoms was not a story of conquest alone. It was a story of adaptation. Communities that had survived fragmentation learned to coordinate. They learned to reward loyalty. They learned to enforce law. They learned to incorporate religion. Leadership became more enduring, even as it remained fragile. Kings could maintain influence across regions, but that influence depended on their ability to negotiate, reward, and enforce agreements continually. Geography continued to shape outcomes. Rivers provided routes for communication and trade. Forests offered protection. Hills could isolate communities or provide defense. Trade re-emerged, connecting kingdoms through the exchange of goods, ideas, and influence. Markets were modest, but strategic. Luxury goods moved among elites, reinforcing hierarchy. Economy and politics were inseparable. Control of resources enabled kings to maintain loyalty and expand influence. Without resources, promises of protection and gifts faltered. By the early 8th century, a new balance had emerged. Britain was no longer a collection of fragmented villages. It was a mosaic of early kingdoms, each centered on a king who ruled by negotiation, gifts, and the projection of strength. Unity remained fragile. Conflict was constant. Ambition was limited by geography, loyalty, and the constraints of local power. Yet the system endured. Kings could coordinate multiple communities. Assemblies maintained law. Christianity provided moral and administrative support. Power had shifted from survival to organization, from flexibility to negotiation, from mere endurance to structure. The rise of these kingdoms did not solve all problems. It did not create lasting unification. It did not remove the possibility of collapse. But it established a template, a framework for leadership that could withstand internal competition and external threats. The era of personal, flexible power had evolved into something broader. Kingship now balanced war, negotiation, law, and faith. Authority required continual attention. Consent mattered as much as might. The next century would test these structures. Kings would attempt to expand influence, consolidate territory, and assert dominance. The negotiation that had maintained stability would meet ambition that demanded more than loyalty. The story of early kingdoms was a story of balance. The balance between loyalty and force, between negotiation and authority, between tradition and innovation, and the tension between these forces would shape Britain for generations to come. The consolidation of early kingdoms was not uniform. Each region adapted its own mix of loyalty, negotiation, and force. In Northumbria, rivers like the Tyne and the Humber became lifelines. Settlements clustered along these waterways, connecting farming villages with fortified halls. Kings relied on kinship networks that stretched from valley to valley. Loyal followers were rewarded with land, livestock, and weapons. Those who failed to maintain loyalty risked isolation or, worse. Northumbrian assemblies gathered regularly, often in open clearings or at hilltops that marked neutral ground. Here, disputes were debated, claims tested, and obligations enforced. Law was memory crystallized into spoken authority. For minor transgressions, compensation could restore balance. For greater offenses, force could be authorized but always within the framework of expectation. Mercia's rise followed a different pattern. The Central Midlands, a patchwork of forests, rivers, and fertile plains, demanded careful negotiation. Mercian kings had to secure loyalty across scattered communities. Generosity became a tool as much as military skill. Feasts, gift-giving, and ceremonial displays reinforced authority. War remained essential, but it was selective, aimed at reinforcing relationships rather than conquering territory indiscriminately. The assembly system persisted, but it evolved. Larger gatherings allowed multiple communities to negotiate simultaneously. Mediators emerged as critical figures, whose voice carried more weight than the sword alone. These councils managed disputes that crossed village boundaries. They were the practical instruments through which kings exercised influence without absolute power. Wessex, along the southern plains, leveraged fertile farmland and coastal access. Its kings maintained smaller, tighter networks of loyalty. Control was not universal, but deeply personal. A hall here was not just a center of governance, it was a symbol of survival. Followers measured a king's capability by his ability to feed, protect, and reward them. Christianity deepened its presence across these kingdoms during this period. Missionaries, often monks, traveled along rivers, coasts, and roads, connecting communities. They brought literacy, record-keeping, and moral authority. Christianity did not replace customary law. Instead, it reinforced it, providing a framework that complemented existing loyalty networks. A king who aligned himself with the church gained prestige, legitimacy, and a network that extended beyond immediate followers. In Northumbria, Christian influence was particularly significant. Bishops and monasteries became centers of both spiritual guidance and political memory. Royal charters, donations, and agreements were recorded, preserving claims across generations. This allowed kings to assert authority even after death. Christianity gave permanence to personal power, connecting loyalty to divine sanction. Mercia saw a similar dynamic. Here, the church acted as mediator, often resolving disputes between rival families or clans. It could endorse tribute arrangements, codify compensation rates, and reinforce assemblies' decisions. The presence of Christian clerics provided a moral framework that legitimized authority without replacing negotiation. In Wessex, the relationship between church and king was subtler, but no less important. Missionaries served as advisors, recorders, and educators. Christian influence gave local elites tools to assert influence over territory, while ensuring obligations were remembered and enforced. Across these kingdoms, law codes were compiled and circulated. They codified customary rules, compensation rates for injury, procedures for assemblies, obligations of kinship, and protocols for disputes. These codes did not centralize power. They structured it. They gave kings a reference point for negotiation and enforcement. They preserved memory where oral tradition might fail. Loyalty, negotiation, and faith coexisted in a delicate balance. Kings were not absolute rulers. They were leaders of relationships. Their power depended on their ability to maintain bonds. Violence reinforced loyalty, but it could not replace it. Even within a single kingdom, authority varied. Some regions were tightly controlled, where kinship networks were strong and assemblies cohesive. Other regions remained semi-autonomous, where distant halls maintained only fragile influence. Geography shaped this. Rivers, forests, and hills defined reach and limitation. Kings adapted to this reality, reinforcing areas they could influence and negotiating with areas they could not. Trade was modest but critical. Rivers, coasts, and overland routes facilitated movement of goods, grain, salt, livestock, and occasionally imported luxury items. These exchanges reinforced political networks. Generosity, whether gifts of food, silver, or weapons, cemented relationships between ruler and follower, king and subordinate king, or kin group and kin group. Power remained personal. A king could not issue commands that were ignored. A hall without followers was powerless. A leader who failed to protect or reward lost authority quickly. Conflict shaped authority as much as diplomacy. Minor skirmishes, raids, and retaliations were common. They tested loyalty. They measured competence. They were also carefully contained to avoid destabilizing networks. By the late 8th century, Britain was a patchwork of these early kingdoms, each shaped by local circumstance, geography, and the networks of obligation that held them together. Kings ruled not by absolute force but by a combination of negotiation, ceremonial display, reward, and selective violence. Christianity, assemblies, law codes, and kinship networks provided the framework within which power operated. These systems were not rigid. They were adaptable. They allowed kingdoms to survive both internal disputes and external pressures. Yet vulnerability remained. Because power was personal and local, succession could be destabilizing. A king's death tested loyalty networks. Ambition could disrupt delicate balances. Alliances could shift suddenly. The rise of these early kingdoms marked a turning point. Britain was no longer fragmented villages. It was organized, but still flexible. It had survived fragmentation and now had the beginnings of enduring structure. But the system relied on constant negotiation, attention, and adaptability. The next century would challenge these arrangements. Kings would attempt to expand their authority further. Rival kingdoms would push back. Religion, law, and war would all intersect in new ways. The balance established by these early rulers between negotiation and force, loyalty and ambition, local custom, and emerging centralization would shape the trajectory of Britain for generations. The foundations were in place. But the pressures of expansion, consolidation, and ambition had only just begun. The 8th century arrived quietly, and with it, a storm from across the sea. For decades, the coasts of Britain had watched visitors arrive by boat, sometimes traders, sometimes raiders. By the late 700s, these arrivals became violent. Viking longships, sleek and fast, struck without warning. They came to raid monasteries, towns, and settlements, taking gold, livestock, and captives. The violence was sudden, shocking, but it was also the beginning of something far more enduring. The first raids were tactical. Monasteries were preferred targets because they were wealthy and poorly defended. Lindisfarne in 793 shocked Christendom. The monastery's treasures were carried away. The monks' sacred spaces violated. The message was clear. Britain was vulnerable. But the raids did not destroy society. They exposed its limits. They revealed fragility. And they forced adaptation. Kingdoms that had survived fragmentation and consolidation suddenly faced pressure from an external force they could not easily negotiate with. Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex kingships built on loyalty. Assemblies and negotiated authority found their systems tested. Local networks were insufficient against raiders who ignored customs, law, and fealty. The response was uneven. Some regions reinforced coastal defenses. Others negotiated payments or tribute. Still, others fell. Power became reactive. By the mid-9th century, the raids evolved. Vikings no longer returned home each season. They wintered in Britain. They established bases, fortresses, and eventually settlements. What had begun as pillage became permanence. This permanence changed everything. The kingdoms of Britain could no longer rely solely on negotiation and loyalty. Force was required not to punish neighbors, but to defend against invaders. Warrior culture intensified. Military obligation became central to survival. Some kingdoms collapsed entirely under pressure. Northumbria fractured into smaller territories. Mercia lost control over its eastern lands. Wessex survived, but at a constant cost. Leadership now required not only skill in negotiation and loyalty, but endurance under relentless external pressure. From this chaos emerged the Danelaw, a patchwork of Viking-controlled territory stretching from the northeast down to the Midlands. It was not an empire imposed from above. It was a negotiated settlement between force, survival, and local compromise. Vikings recognized fertile land, navigable rivers, and defensible settlements. They integrated with local communities, marrying, trading, and settling. Cultural blending followed naturally. Old laws were observed alongside new customs. Landholding adapted to Viking practices, yet retained Anglo-Saxon forms. Language changed, words, names, and terms merged across communities. Governance became hybrid. Assemblies continued, but with Viking influence. The Danelaw was not a simple conquest. It was a society reshaped. Violence had not erased identity, it transformed it. Britain's Anglo-Saxons and Vikings coexisted, competed, and collaborated. Trade resumed under new rules. Settlements prospered where alliances were stable. Monasteries survived by negotiating with new powers. Christianity persisted. It adapted. Vikings sometimes converted, sometimes patronized monasteries to ensure protection. Faith became both a tool and a stabilizer. The church mediated, recorded, and legitimized authority even under foreign rulers. Power, as always, remained personal. Kings, chieftains, and local lords had to maintain loyalty, reward service, and enforce law. But now, the definition of community had expanded. Authority had to accommodate newcomers. Customs were flexible out of necessity. Negotiation was constant. By the late 9th century, Britain had been profoundly altered. The kingdoms of old had not vanished entirely, but their borders, authority, and culture had changed. Where once Northumbria was a unified realm, it now contained Viking enclaves. Mercia was partially absorbed into the Danelaw. Wessex remained independent, but hardened against intrusion. The Vikings did not erase Britain, they reshaped it. Communities learned resilience again, this time under pressure from outsiders who respected nothing and demanded everything. Trade, law, religion, and culture adapted. The result was a society neither purely Anglo-Saxon nor purely Scandinavian, but a hybrid capable of surviving in a fragmented, contested landscape. This period forced Britain to reconsider the nature of authority. Kingship had always been negotiation, loyalty, and gift-giving. Now, it also required adaptability to foreign norms. Assemblies incorporated new voices. Law codes reflected blended customs. Churches mediated across cultural boundaries. The shock of the Viking arrival revealed that Britain's survival depended not on rigid hierarchy, but on flexibility. The systems built by early kingdoms were resilient, but only if they could adjust to sudden, extreme disruption. And Britain would face more of these disruptions in the centuries to come. By the end of the 9th century, the landscape of power had been irrevocably changed. Settlements, law, and culture had shifted. Britain's identity had expanded without erasing the past. The Danelaw was not a foreign imposition, it was part of the ongoing evolution of local, personal, and flexible authority. Invasion did not destroy society. It tested it. It reshaped it. It forced adaptation. The lessons of this era were clear. Resilience is built through negotiation, flexibility, and integration, not through avoidance of disruption. Britain had survived the Vikings, but survival came at the cost of fragmented authority, hybrid culture, and ongoing tension. The next chapter would show how Wessex, under determined leadership, would confront these pressures. It would unify resistance, consolidate power, and begin the process of reclaiming what had been lost. The stage was set for a transformation that would redefine the island once again. By the early 9th century, Viking activity in Britain had intensified. No longer were the longships seasonal raiders, they wintered on the coasts, building fortified camps that became permanent bases. These camps were not mere military outposts. They were footholds for settlement, for governance, and for the reshaping of society. The Kingdom of Northumbria, once powerful along the northern valleys, struggled under repeated attacks. Raids from the east, particularly from Danish forces, undermined the authority of kings who had once ruled through loyalty and negotiation alone. Monasteries, previously symbols of spiritual authority, were now prime targets. Wealth stored in sacred spaces attracted raiders. Lindisfarne's devastation in 793 was only the beginning. Other abbeys, including Jarrow and Monkwearmouth, faced repeated plundering. Northumbrian kings attempted to defend their realm through a combination of force and diplomacy. Local leaders were marshaled for defense. Fortified towns were reinforced. Tributes were negotiated with Viking leaders in some cases to prevent destruction. Yet these measures were temporary. Raids tested every aspect of authority, and sometimes the only surviving strategy was survival by compromise. In Mercia, the situation was equally precarious. The Central Midlands, a patchwork of rivers, forests, and scattered villages, provided opportunities for Vikings to strike unpredictably. Kings relied on swift mobilization of local warriors and the loyalty of regional lords to resist incursions. At the same time, they were forced to negotiate, paying tribute or granting concessions to settle temporary peace. Wessex in the south emerged as the kingdom most capable of resisting permanent Viking control. The geography of Wessex, with its hills and river networks, allowed for strategic defense. Kings such as Egbert and his successors learned to combine military action with strategic negotiation. Rather than trying to confront every Viking landing directly, they concentrated on protecting key centers of loyalty and agriculture. This approach emphasized flexibility and pragmatism, a theme consistent across surviving Anglo-Saxon polities. Meanwhile, Viking settlements began to change the cultural and legal landscape of Britain. The Danelaw, as it would be called, was not imposed overnight. It emerged gradually as Vikings integrated into territories in the Northeast and Midlands. Communities adapted existing Anglo-Saxon laws alongside Scandinavian practices. Landholding evolved. Some estates followed Anglo-Saxon inheritance rules, while others observed Norse customs. Assemblies continued to meet, but now they included representatives of Viking settlers. Loyalty, compensation, and dispute resolution remained central, but the cultural vocabulary expanded. Trade and material culture reflected this blending. River systems allowed for the movement of grain, livestock, and timber. Luxury goods, including silver and ornaments, circulated between Anglo-Saxon elites and Viking settlers. Markets began to emerge, connecting previously isolated regions. Vikings brought knowledge of maritime networks that extended to Ireland, Frisia, and Scandinavia, increasing the reach of local economies. Christianity remained a stabilizing force. Monasteries adapted by negotiating with Viking rulers. Some abbeys paid tribute. Others offered hospitality or negotiated protection in exchange for moral authority. Missionaries occasionally converted Scandinavian leaders, creating alliances between faith and power. These conversions were pragmatic as much as spiritual. A Christian Viking could claim legitimacy and integrate more easily into local networks. Law codes recorded this transformation. Anglo-Saxon charters and legal texts continued to regulate compensation, land disputes, and kinship obligations. But new clauses appeared reflecting the hybrid reality of Viking presence. Some settlements codified Norse customs, including inheritance rights and dispute resolution, while retaining Anglo-Saxon principles. This legal blending reflected the larger social reality. Invasion did not erase society, it reshaped it. Violence continued, but it was no longer the sole measure of power. Military force coexisted with negotiation, alliances, and compromise. Kings had to balance authority between local elites, Viking settlers, and the church. Assemblies became sites of diplomacy as much as governance. The ability to mediate disputes across cultural boundaries became central to leadership. Over time, Viking settlement produced demographic and cultural shifts. Place names in the Danelaw changed to reflect Scandinavian influence. Communities adopted Norse agricultural techniques and crafts. Local language incorporated new words and expressions. Yet these settlers did not completely replace existing populations. Rather, they blended, creating hybrid communities that were neither fully Anglo-Saxon nor fully Scandinavian. This blending had long-term consequences. Britain's political map became more complex. Kings in Wessex, for instance, maintained independence but had to interact with the Danelaw through negotiation, tribute, and strategic alliances. The experience of Viking pressure demonstrated the limits of local authority and emphasized the importance of flexible, adaptive leadership. The collapse of some kingdoms revealed the fragility inherent in personal, negotiated power. Northumbria fractured, Mercia lost eastern control, and smaller polities were absorbed into Viking-administered regions. Only those rulers capable of combining negotiation, loyalty, management, and military strategy survived intact. By the late 9th century, Britain had been irrevocably altered. The Danelaw was established. Hybrid communities flourished. Kingship evolved to accommodate both continuity and adaptation. Local authority remained vital, but external pressures now shaped its expression. This era revealed a fundamental lesson. Invasion did not destroy society. It exposed weakness, forced adaptation, and reshaped cultural, legal, and economic systems. Britain survived by integrating the newcomers, blending law, faith, and custom into a resilient, if hybridized, social fabric. The Viking period left a Britain both fragmented and interconnected. Old kingdoms persisted where they could, but new realities, foreign settlers, hybrid laws, and shifting loyalties challenged traditional power structures. The island's communities learned, again, to survive by negotiation, flexibility, and adaptation. Yet this adaptation carried a cost. Local power remained personal and contingent. Unity was fragile. Ambition could exploit any weakness. The stage was set for a Wessex resurgence and the eventual reconsolidation of Britain. The lessons of this century were clear. Survival depended on flexibility. Integration mattered more than destruction. Custom, law, and faith could stabilize societies under pressure. And even in the face of violent intrusion, Britain's social systems endured, transformed but not erased. The next chapter would examine the rise of Wessex, the consolidation of resistance, and the reconquest that would lay the foundation for a unified kingdom. The balance between local authority and emerging central power would once again be tested, and this time on a scale Britain had never seen. By the early 9th century, Viking incursions had shifted from sporadic raids to sustained campaigns of conquest and settlement. Longships small enough to navigate rivers but formidable on open waters, struck with speed and precision. Coastal villages, often lightly defended, were the first targets. But over time, the raids penetrated deeper into the interior. The east coast of Northumbria bore the brunt of early attacks. Monasteries like Lindisfarne, Jarrow, and Monkwymouth had already suffered pillage. These sites were not only wealthy, they were symbols of continuity, memory, and moral authority. By destroying them, Vikings sent a clear signal: no sanctity could protect you. Northumbrian kings, accustomed to governing through negotiation and loyalty, faced a profound challenge. Assemblies became urgent centers of strategy. Leaders debated whether to confront the raiders, pay tribute, or retreat. Local warriors were called to arms. Communities fortified what they could. Yet the Vikings were adaptable. They did not rely on large armies. They relied on mobility, surprise, and the exploitation of divided authority. No single king could respond effectively across a fragmented realm. Northumbria's cohesion, once a strength, became a vulnerability. Its western territories resisted. its eastern lands succumbed. Mercia faced similar pressures. The Midlands, though geographically challenging, could not insulate the kingdom indefinitely. Raids along the Trent and Ouse rivers threatened farmland, settlements, and communication. Mercian kings developed layered responses, fortified towns, rapid mobilization of kin-based warbands, and negotiation when force failed. Tribute, temporary alliances, and even concessions became necessary tools of survival. Wessex, further south, approached the Viking problem differently. Its rulers understood geography as both shield and weapon. Hills, rivers, and dense woods could hinder Viking movement. Rather than confront every landing, Wessex kings chose strategic battles. They protected population centers, defended key routes, and allowed less critical areas to suffer minor raids. This pragmatic approach emphasized endurance over immediate victory. By the 850s, Vikings were no longer seasonal raiders, they were settlers. They built fortified bases along rivers and coasts, establishing winter encampments that became permanent communities. The settlement patterns revealed strategic thinking, control of trade routes, access to fertile land, and defensible positions. These settlements gradually evolved into the territories known as the Danelaw. The Danelaw represented a hybrid system of governance. Anglo-Saxon assemblies persisted, but now included representatives of Scandinavian settlers. Laws were adapted to reflect both Anglo-Saxon and Norse customs. Inheritance, landholding, and compensation merged into a blended legal framework. Disputes could be resolved under either system, depending on local practice and the parties involved. Cultural integration followed naturally. Place names changed. Many towns and regions bore Scandinavian names by the end of the century. Language evolved, incorporating Norse words and expressions into the local vernacular. Art, craft, and material culture reflected hybrid influence. Tools, weapons, and ornaments combined Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian styles. Trade also adapted. Rivers and coasts facilitated the movement of grain, livestock, timber, and imported luxury goods. Silver, often melted into coins or jewelry, became both currency and symbol of wealth. Markets emerged where communities Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, or hybrid could interact. Trade reinforced loyalty networks and tied settlers to existing power structures. Christianity remained a stabilizing force amid this turbulence. Monasteries adapted to the presence of Viking settlers, negotiating protection or paying tribute when necessary. Some Viking leaders converted, often strategically, to secure legitimacy and integrate with local elites. The church became a mediator, recording agreements, mediating disputes, and offering moral sanction to authority. Faith did not eliminate violence. It provided a framework in which violence could be negotiated and contained. In Northumbria, the fragmentation was profound. Kings were displaced, regional warlords gained autonomy, and Viking settlements became permanent. Yet the core population adapted. They continued farming, trade persisted, and assemblies met to resolve disputes under blended laws. The societal structure survived, but its character had changed. Mercia, though weakened, demonstrated resilience. Its kings retained control over western regions, defended strategic centers, and maintained ties with Wessex. Mercian law codes were revised to accommodate Viking settlers, creating hybrid practices that allowed survival without full conquest. Here, negotiation and law supplanted immediate force as the primary instrument of authority. Wessex remained the model of resistance and adaptation. Its leaders developed strategies for long-term survival and eventual reconquest. By consolidating loyalty, protecting key settlements, and forging alliances, Wessex prepared to counter the Danelaw. Military skill, combined with negotiation and strategic generosity, allowed Wessex to endure, while other kingdoms faltered. The Viking presence reshaped landholding patterns. Estates were divided, sometimes granting plots to settlers under new obligations. Customary rights were renegotiated. Legal flexibility became essential. Violence could enforce law, but only alongside negotiation and consensus. Communities adapted socially as well. Marriage between settlers and locals created dense networks of kinship. These networks stabilized hybrid communities, allowing both Anglo-Saxon and Viking traditions to coexist. Children grew up bilingual, learning laws from both sides. This blending produced resilience that pure conquest could not achieve. By the end of the 9th century, Britain's political landscape had transformed. The Danelaw was established, yet it coexisted with surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Authority was hybrid, personal, negotiated, and culturally blended. Trade, law, religion, and social ties connected communities across ethnic and regional boundaries. The lesson was clear: invasion did not erase society. It exposed vulnerabilities, forced adaptation, and reshaped political, legal, and cultural systems. Britain survived not through avoidance of conflict, but through integration, negotiation, and flexibility. Yet this transformation was incomplete. Local power remained essential. Unity was fragile. Ambition could exploit gaps. The stage was set for Wessex to consolidate resistance, reclaim territory, and lay the foundations for a unified kingdom. The balance between negotiation, personal loyalty, hybrid law, and cultural integration defined survival. It would also define the next phase of Britain's history, as kingdoms rebuilt strength, forged alliances, and confronted the lingering influence of Viking power. The stage was set. The island, fractured yet resilient, was poised for reconstruction. The systems built in response to violence would endure, tested by ambition, geography, and the persistence of external threat. And from this crucible, the seeds of a unified England would eventually emerge. By the late 9th century, Wessex stood on the edge of collapse. The Viking threat was no longer seasonal raids or isolated settlements. It had become an existential pressure. Longships patrolled rivers and coasts. Raiding parties struck deep into the heart of the kingdom. Communities fled. Farms were abandoned. Halls, once symbols of kingship and authority, were burned. Wessex was alone. Mercia had been fragmented. Northumbria reduced by settlement and strife. Kent and Sussex were under pressure. Only Wessex remained capable of mounting resistance. In this crisis, a leader emerged. Alfred, son of Ethelwulf, he inherited a kingdom weakened, demoralized, and under siege. But Alfred understood something fundamental. Brute force alone could not preserve Wessex. Strength had to be organized. Authority had to be systematic. Survival demanded reform. Alfred's first insight was military. He understood the limitations of traditional Anglo-Saxon warbands. Loyalty alone could not repel a persistent, mobile enemy. He reorganized the army, creating a system of rotations. A portion of the forces remained active in the field, ready to respond to raids. Another portion defended settlements. This ensured that Wessex could sustain resistance over time rather than exhaust itself in single, decisive battles. But defense was more than men in the field. Alfred's genius lay in infrastructure. He built a network of burst-fortified settlements strategically placed to protect population centers, control rivers, and safeguard trade routes. These were not simple stockades. They were carefully planned, integrated into the landscape, and designed to serve both military and civil purposes. Burhs allowed Wessex to withstand sieges, offer refuge, and maintain communication across the kingdom. The burh system was paired with roads and signaling networks. Movements of troops could be coordinated across vast distances. This transformed Wessex from a fragmented collection of local loyalties into a cohesive, responsive system. Geography, once a barrier to central authority, became a tool of defense. Hills, rivers, and coastlines were not obstacles. They were incorporated into planning. Alfred also reformed administration. He understood that survival depended on resources, loyalty, and organization. Taxes were standardized to fund defenses. Local leaders were accountable for maintaining burhs, supplying men, and reporting threats. Assemblies retained their role, but they now operated within a framework that connected local action to royal strategy. Authority became systematic without abandoning the personal relationships that had long defined Anglo-Saxon kingship. Education and learning became part of survival strategy. Alfred recognized that knowledge was power. If Wessex were to endure, it needed more than warriors. It needed administrators, clergy, and educated men capable of recording laws, managing resources, and mediating disputes. He promoted learning in English rather than Latin, ensuring that knowledge was accessible to his subjects. Translations of biblical texts, historical works, and legal codes created a literate elite able to implement and sustain reforms. Law itself became a cornerstone of Alfred's strategy. He codified customs, reinforced existing rights, and adapted rules to the demands of a kingdom under constant threat. Justice was not merely symbolic, it was functional. It bound communities to the crown, reinforced loyalty, and structured obligations. Alfred's laws integrated moral authority, tradition, and practical governance. They were tools of cohesion as much as fairness. Military, administrative, and educational reforms combined to create a kingdom capable of surviving the Viking onslaught. Wessex was no longer reactive. It became proactive. It could anticipate threats, respond systematically, and maintain social cohesion, even under pressure. The Viking threat, however, did not disappear. Raids continued. Settlements pressed south. Wessex was tested repeatedly. But each test validated Alfred's reforms. Troops could be mobilized efficiently. Burhs held. Communication allowed rapid coordination. Local leaders were accountable. The kingdom endured where others had failed. Alfred's strategies also had cultural consequences. By promoting learning in English, he elevated the vernacular and reinforced national identity. People could read laws, understand obligations, and participate in governance. Literacy created cohesion beyond personal loyalty. It strengthened the kingdom internally, even as the Viking threat pressed from the outside. The reforms reshaped society. Burhs became centers of trade, administration, and refuge. Assemblies coordinated defense and justice. Churches mediated disputes and provided moral support. Education created a cadre of literate leaders capable of sustaining these systems. Even war became a disciplined, organized activity rather than an episodic display of strength. Alfred's success lay in organization, not brute force. He understood that a kingdom is a system, not a collection of individual warriors. Infrastructure, administration, law, and education allowed Wessex to survive repeated Viking assaults. Military skill remained essential, but it was now embedded in a broader structure that amplified effectiveness. By the end of Alfred's reign, Wessex had transformed. The kingdom had resisted near-total collapse. It had stabilized territories, reinforced loyalty networks, and integrated new forms of administration. The Viking threat was contained, though not eliminated. Settlements persisted in some regions, but Wessex had created a model of survival under sustained external pressure. The lesson of Alfred's reign was profound. Organization beats brute force. A kingdom could not rely solely on valor or fear. It required systems that coordinated resources, enforced obligations, and preserved knowledge. It required foresight, discipline, and integration of military, legal, and cultural tools. Alfred's reforms laid the foundation for the future. Wessex would become the core from which a unified England eventually emerged. The burghs he built would continue to serve as centers of power. The law codes would guide governance for generations. Education and literacy would create continuity in leadership beyond the personal charisma of any single ruler. Britain, tested by invasion, fragmentation, and violence, had learned again to survive. But this survival was not passive. It was active, deliberate, and systemic. The kingdom endured not because it was strongest, but because it was organized, disciplined, and adaptable. The next chapter would examine how Wessex leveraged these reforms to reclaim lost territory, confront Viking settlements, and consolidate power into a structure approaching national unification. The tension between local authority, personal loyalty, and centralized administration would continue to define the island's destiny, and Alfred's legacy would show that survival under pressure is achieved through innovation, system building, and the careful alignment of society, military, and culture. Alfred's reign was defined by constant pressure. The Vikings were not a distant threat, they were at Wessex's door. In 871, the great heathen army struck again. Skirmishes erupted across the kingdom. Towns were threatened, crops were seized, and villages burned. Wessex faced the possibility of collapse, but Alfred had learned from prior failures. He did not rely on a single battle to save the kingdom. Instead, he structured defense around the burgh's fortified settlements, strategically placed across the kingdom. Each burgh was designed to shelter civilians, store resources, and act as a base for counterattacks. Key locations included Wareham in Dorset, Athelney in Somerset, and Winchester, the royal center. These burghs were not only defensive, they were administrative. Each required careful organization, supply chains for food, coordination of garrisons, and local oversight. Alfred's officials ensured that local lords were accountable for the maintenance and defense of each fortification. Assemblies were held within burghs to adjudicate disputes, enforce law, and coordinate collective action. Communication between burghs was critical. Alfred implemented a network of roads and signaling systems, including beacons, messengers, and mounted couriers. This allowed Wessex to respond quickly to Viking movements. No longer could raiders move unchallenged through the kingdom. The burgh system transformed Wessex from reactive to proactive. Alfred combined this infrastructure with military innovation. He reorganized the fyrd, the local levy of free men obligated to fight. Rather than leaving the entire levy in the field, he instituted rotations. Some men remained to defend burghs while others engaged Vikings on campaign. This prevented exhaustion, ensured continuous defense, and allowed for rapid concentration of forces when needed. The strategic genius of Alfred's approach was in balance. He did not seek to annihilate every Viking. He focused on controlling key territories, maintaining morale, and preserving the population. Wessex became a resilient network of defended centers rather than a single vulnerable capital. Education was another cornerstone of Alfred's survival strategy. He believed that a literate and knowledgeable leadership class was essential for governance, law, and long-term stability. Alfred commissioned translations of religious texts, historical works, and legal codes into English. These works were accessible to administrators, clergy, and local leaders, ensuring that knowledge did not remain confined to Latin-literate elites. The emphasis on vernacular literacy strengthened identity and cohesion across Wessex. Alfred's legal reforms were closely tied to survival. He codified laws that combined traditional Anglo-Saxon customs with practical governance. Compensation rates, obligations to the king, and procedures for dispute resolution were clearly defined. By recording these rules, Alfred reduced disputes that could weaken loyalty networks. Law became an instrument of stability, ensuring that personal obligations and collective security reinforced each other. The integration of military, legal, and educational reforms was apparent during campaigns against Viking incursions. When Vikings attacked the south coast, burghs could shelter civilians while trained fyrds responded. Local assemblies coordinated reinforcements, enforced obligations, and maintained supply lines. Churches mediated, provided refuge, and recorded agreements. This multi-layered approach ensured that Wessex could endure prolonged pressure that had destroyed other kingdoms. Alfred's reforms also had cultural consequences. Education in English elevated the vernacular, creating a shared sense of identity. Burhs became centers not only of defense, but of trade, learning, and governance. Churches provided continuity, moral authority, and social cohesion. Even during raids, communities could find stability within these structured networks. The burh system had practical geographic advantages. Fortifications were built along rivers, hills, and natural choke points. This allowed Wessex to control movement, protect fertile farmland, and intercept raiders before they reached populated areas. Rivers served as both trade routes and defensive barriers. Hills provided observation points and natural fortification. Alfred turned the landscape into an instrument of survival. By integrating law, learning, and military infrastructure, Alfred created a kingdom capable of enduring repeated Viking pressure. He recognized that survival was not about individual heroics. It was about systemic organization. A king could not rely solely on valor or intimidation. He required administrative structures, disciplined forces, and informed leaders. The consequences of Alfred's reforms extended beyond his reign. Wessex emerged as the nucleus of a reconsolidated England. The burhs he built became enduring urban centers. The legal codes shaped governance for decades. Education in English fostered literacy, cultural cohesion, and bureaucratic continuity. Alfred's approach combined reactive defense with long-term planning. Vikings continued to threaten the kingdom, but their incursions were mitigated by preparedness. Counterattacks could be coordinated efficiently, and local populations were protected. Authority remained personal, rooted in loyalty and leadership, but it was amplified through systematic infrastructure. Even as Wessex survived, Alfred demonstrated that effective governance required integration. Military strategy, law, administration, and education were inseparable. The kingdom's strength derived not from any single element, but from their interaction. A failure in one area, such as poorly maintained burhs, illiterate administrators, or lax enforcement of law, could compromise survival. The system demanded attention, discipline, and foresight. By the end of Alfred's reign, Wessex had transformed from a threatened kingdom into a resilient polity. The Viking threat remained, but the kingdom had developed the tools to survive and recover. The burh network, educational reforms, legal codification, and military organization created a foundation for reconquest and consolidation. Alfred's legacy was clear. Survival is built on systems, not brute force. A kingdom can withstand repeated external pressure if its institutions are coherent, integrated, and resilient. Military skill matters, but only when embedded within a broader framework of governance, law, and culture. The next chapter would follow Wessex as it moved from survival to Alfred's reforms set the stage for the eventual recovery of territories under Viking control, the reassertion of centralized authority, and the emergence of a kingdom capable of unifying England. The tension between personal loyalty, systemic authority, and external threat would continue to define the island's destiny. By the mid-880s, Alfred's Wessex was still under siege. Vikings did not relent. Raids came in waves, striking villages, crossing rivers, and threatening key towns. Each attack tested the kingdom's resilience. The Battle of Edington in 878 would become a defining moment, but it was preceded by years of preparation, adaptation, and reform. Alfred had learned that direct confrontation alone was insufficient. The Viking strategy relied on mobility, surprise, and the exploitation of local divisions. One isolated village could not resist a raiding party, but a network of burhs, coordinated fires, and local leadership could blunt the impact. Alfred's genius was integrating these elements into a coherent system. The burh network had expanded and matured. Hundreds of fortified sites dotted Wessex from the fertile plains of Wiltshire to the river valleys of Somerset. Each burh had multiple functions: defense, administration, trade, and refuge. They were carefully located to maximize control of movement, protect farmland, and support rapid military response. Garrisons were assigned to rotate between burhs and field operations, ensuring continuous coverage and readiness. Supply and logistics were critical. Burhs stored grain, livestock, and weapons, allowing communities to survive sieges. Local officials were responsible for maintenance and provisioning, linking personal loyalty to practical obligation. Assemblies met within burhs to enforce law, resolve disputes, and coordinate collective action. This created a dynamic where governance and defense were inseparable. Alfred's military reforms extended beyond static fortifications. He reorganized the brigade, creating a rotational system that kept part of the army active in the field while another portion defended settlements. This ensured that Wessex could respond flexibly to Viking movements. Scouting, intelligence, and signaling networks allowed rapid concentration of forces at threatened locations. The Vikings' traditional advantage, speed and surprise, was mitigated by Alfred's coordination and preparation. The Battle of Edington in 878 exemplified these reforms in action. After a series of raids and territorial losses, Alfred concentrated his forces strategically. He used burhs as staging areas, mobilized local levies efficiently, and integrated intelligence from scouts and allies. The battle was decisive. Vikings were defeated, their forces fragmented, and the path to negotiation opened. Alfred's victory was not just martial, it was systemic. It was a triumph of preparation, organization, and strategic foresight. The aftermath of Edington illustrates the breadth of Alfred's reforms. Rather than imposing indiscriminate punishment, he negotiated with surviving Viking leaders. Treaties defined boundaries, tribute obligations, and settlement arrangements. The Danelaw in eastern England persisted, but its relationship with Wessex was now structured and regulated. Alfred's system had survived both violent attack and political negotiation. Administrative reforms reinforced these gains. Local leaders were accountable for law enforcement, tax collection, and burh maintenance. Assemblies became centers of coordination, linking local authority with royal oversight. Officials were literate, trained, and capable of recording obligations and resolving disputes. This reduced reliance on personal charisma alone. The kingdom became a functioning system rather than a network of personal loyalties. Education and learning complemented these administrative reforms. Alfred promoted literacy in English, making knowledge accessible to a broader segment of the population. Translations of the Bible, historical works, and law codes provided officials and clergy with tools to govern effectively. Knowledge became part of survival strategy, ensuring that Wessex's institutions could function even if individual leaders failed or died. Law remained central to Alfred's vision of survival. He codified and adapted earlier Anglo-Saxon customs, integrating them with practical governance. Compensation, dispute resolution, and community obligations were clearly defined. By doing so, Alfred reinforced loyalty networks, structured obligations, and reduced internal conflict. Law was not abstract, it was a practical tool of administration, defense, and societal cohesion. The burhs themselves were centers of social and economic activity. Markets developed within fortified settlements. Trade and craft flourished even under the shadow of war. Burhs became nodes of integration, military, administrative, legal, and economic functions combined. This multifunctional design strengthened Wessex's resilience. Viking settlements persisted in areas outside Wessex, but Alfred's reforms allowed the kingdom to recover territory gradually. Military campaigns could be launched from secure burhs, logistical support was reliable, and local authorities maintained order. This system of organized resilience allowed Wessex not only to survive but to expand influence. Alfred's emphasis on education created a literate leadership capable of sustaining governance beyond his reign. Clerics and administrators recorded treaties, tax obligations, and legal decisions. Knowledge became institutional rather than personal. This continuity was critical in ensuring that Wessex could maintain cohesion even after Alfred's death. By combining military innovation, administrative rigor, law, and education, Alfred created a model of governance capable of withstanding external pressure. Survival was not passive, it was deliberate, systemic, and integrated across all aspects of society. Wessex endured because its institutions functioned together, amplifying the effectiveness of kingship. The long-term impact of Alfred's reforms was profound. Burhs became permanent towns and centers of power. Law codes influenced governance for generations. Education and literacy created administrative continuity. Wessex emerged from near collapse to become the nucleus of a reconsolidated England. Alfred's reign demonstrates that survival under sustained pressure requires more than valor or force. It demands organization, planning, and integration of society, military, and culture. A kingdom that functions as a system can endure, adapt, and eventually expand, even under relentless threat. By the end of Alfred's life, Wessex had transformed. Viking threat was contained. The kingdom's population was organized, defended, and educated. Authority was both personal and systemic, balancing loyalty with structured administration. The next chapter would explore how Wessex leveraged Alfred's reforms to reclaim territories under Viking control, consolidate authority, and establish the foundations of a unified England. The tension between local autonomy, personal loyalty, and centralized governance would continue to shape the island's destiny. The lesson remained: organization beats brute force. Alfred proved that a kingdom's resilience depends not on individual heroics, but on systems military, legal, and cultural that endure, adapt, and integrate all aspects of society. By the dawn of the 10th century, the island of Britain was a patchwork of kingdoms, hybrid cultures, and contested territories. Wessex had survived the Viking onslaught, strengthened by Alfred's reforms, but survival was only the beginning. The kingdom faced a new challenge: consolidation. Expansion under Alfred's heirs would test the resilience of Wessex's systems and define the very concept of England. Edward the Elder, Alfred's son, inherited a kingdom fortified but still surrounded by danger. The Viking presence in the north and east remained strong. The Danelaw, established decades earlier, persisted as a semi-autonomous territory. Viking settlements were integrated into local economies, but they were politically separate, often paying tribute and acknowledging only partial authority to Wessex. Edward's task was not simply to defend Wessex, it was to unify the island under a single crown without repeating the mistakes of conquest or coercion. Military strategy remained central. Edward inherited the burh system, the network of fortified settlements his father had created. These burhs acted as defensive hubs, staging points for campaigns, and centers of administration. Edward expanded the network into newly reconquered territories, ensuring that control was maintained not only through force but through infrastructure. Each burh was a node in a larger system, linking military readiness, civil governance, and economic stability. Edward's campaigns were methodical. Rather than launching unpredictable raids, he advanced in stages, consolidating control over key regions before pushing further. He relied on local alliances, securing the loyalty of lords and communities in previously Viking-held territories. Marriage, tribute, and negotiated submission were used alongside military action. This pragmatic approach minimized resistance and fostered long-term stability. By securing Mercia and reclaiming parts of Northumbria, Edward began to erase the political fragmentation that had defined the island for centuries. Yet unification was more than military conquest. Edward standardized coinage, ensuring economic cohesion. Silver pennies circulated widely, linking markets and establishing a tangible symbol of central authority. Standard weights, measures, and currency reinforced the perception that Wessex and its heirs were the legitimate rulers of a unified domain. Law and governance were likewise integrated. Edward continued Alfred's reforms, applying legal codes to reconquered territories. Assemblies, previously local and autonomous, were now tied into a broader network of royal oversight. Dispute resolution, compensation systems, and obligations to the crown were enforced consistently across the expanded kingdom. This consistency was crucial. It replaced personal loyalty alone with institutional authority that transcended local factions. The church played a key role in unification. Bishops and abbots served as intermediaries, recording agreements, enforcing law, and legitimizing royal authority. Christianity provided a moral and cultural framework that reinforced centralized governance. Churches mediated between Anglo-Saxon lords and Viking settlers, encouraging integration rather than alienation. Cultural integration followed political and legal consolidation. Viking settlers were not expelled. They were incorporated. Marriage, trade, and local customs created hybrid communities. Place names reflected both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon influence. Language evolved, integrating Norse words into English, creating a common tongue capable of uniting diverse populations. Education continued in English, ensuring literacy and administration remained accessible and functional across the kingdom. The emergence of a unified England was gradual. It was not imposed by a single campaign or a single ruler. It arose from decades of strategic planning, negotiated submission, and instant show building. The kingdom grew organically, anchored in Wessex's administrative reforms, military infrastructure, and cultural cohesion. Athelstan, Edward's son, would take unification further. By the 930s, he had consolidated control over most of England, including territories formerly under Viking rule. Athelstan's reign exemplified the principles Alfred had established: organization, law, education, and integration. Military campaigns secured borders, but governance relied equally on law, tribute, and institutional authority. England began to emerge as a recognizable political and cultural entity. Standardized currency, burh administration, and codified law allowed Athelstan to govern a kingdom larger and more diverse than Alfred had ever controlled. Assemblies met across the realm, applying consistent rules and mediating disputes. Local lords were bound into a network of loyalty and obligation. The king's authority was both personal and systemic, rooted in tradition but amplified through infrastructure and law. The concept of England was born not in a single battle, but in the accumulation of reforms, negotiations, and integrations. It was a kingdom defined by governance as much as by territory. Its identity emerged from shared law, currency, religious institutions, and the slow blending of cultures across centuries. Military force alone could not have achieved this. It required systems of administration, education, and justice. Trade and economy were critical to unification. Burhs became centers of commerce, linking previously isolated regions. Silver coinage circulated widely, establishing trust and facilitating exchange. Markets allowed communities to prosper even under external pressure, reinforcing loyalty to the crown. Economic integration made political unification tangible in daily life. The process was slow and deliberate. Viking territories retained some autonomy, and local customs persisted. But over decades, integration deepened. Hybrid communities, shared law, common currency, and coordinated administration created cohesion. England's unity was functional before it was symbolic. Education reinforced this cohesion. Scribes and clerics ensured continuity of governance, recording legal decisions, royal edicts, and treaties. Literacy in English allowed broader participation in administration. Knowledge became part of the kingdom's infrastructure, ensuring that authority could be exercised consistently across distance and culture. The lessons of this century were clear. Unity is built slowly, not conquered instantly. Military victories provide opportunity, but long-term cohesion requires law, infrastructure, economic integration, and cultural adaptation. England emerged as a kingdom not through domination alone, but through systems that connected people, enforced obligations, and encouraged participation. By the end of the 10th century, the island had transformed. Wessex's administrative model, Alfred's Burr network, and the integration of Viking territories had created a kingdom capable of resisting external threats, managing internal disputes, and projecting authority across diverse communities. England was no longer a fragmented collection of kingdoms. It was a political, legal, and cultural entity. The unification of England demonstrates that survival and expansion depend on organization as much as strength. Kingship required foresight, planning, and systemic integration. Authority had to balance personal loyalty with institutional power, military readiness with civil administration, and tradition with innovation. The stage was now set for England to endure, expand, and interact with continental Europe. The island had learned the lessons of fragmentation, invasion, and reform. It had survived through resilience and adaptability, laying the foundation for a kingdom that would persist for centuries. The next chapter would examine how this unified England consolidated its borders, strengthened its institutions, and developed the identity that would endure into the High Middle Ages. The slow work of unification would continue, proving that kingdoms are built in systems, not in a single battle. By the early 10th century, Wessex had transitioned from survival to opportunity. Alfred's reforms had stabilized the kingdom, but survival alone was insufficient. The next generation faced a challenge of integration, consolidation, and expansion. Edward the Elder, Alfred's son, inherited not only a fortified kingdom but also a vision to extend Wessex's authority over territories previously under Viking control. Edward's campaigns were methodical. He understood that military conquest alone could not create lasting unity. The Danelaw, in eastern and northern England, was not a void, it was a network of Viking settlements, partially autonomous, economically productive, and culturally distinct. To impose authority, Edward combined force with negotiation. Marriage alliances, tribute arrangements, and incorporation of local leaders into royal administration reduced resistance and encouraged loyalty. The Burr network, Alfred's innovation, was crucial. Edward expanded it into reconquered territories, reinforcing key towns such as Stamford, Thetford, and Leicester. Each burh served multiple functions. It was a defensive fortification, a center for tax collection, a hub for trade, and a focal point for law enforcement. Garrisons were rotated regularly, linking local populations to royal authority. Assemblies met within burhs, coordinating administration, resolving disputes, and maintaining cohesion across regions. Edward's military strategy was sophisticated. Rather than dispersing his forces across every threatened area, he concentrated troops at strategic points, using intelligence networks to anticipate Viking movements. Rivers, roads, and hilltop vantage points were integrated into planning. He combined rapid strikes with defensive patience, ensuring that raids could be repelled without overextending the kingdom's resources. Economic integration was equally vital. Edward extended standardized coinage into newly acquired territories. Silver pennies circulated widely, linking markets from the south coast to former Viking strongholds in the east. Standard measures and weights facilitated trade and reinforced royal authority. Currency became more than commerce, it was a symbol of a unified kingdom and a practical tool for integration. Law and governance accompanied military expansion. Edward implemented Alfred's legal framework in reconquered territories, ensuring consistency in dispute resolution, compensation, and obligations to the crown. Assemblies, once primarily local, were now integrated into a broader network of oversight. By tying local governance to royal authority, Edward reduced the likelihood of rebellion and strengthened loyalty among both Anglo-Saxon and Viking populations. Education and literacy continued to reinforce governance. Administrators, clergy, and scribes maintained records of law, taxation, and agreements. English, rather than Latin, remained a medium of administration, ensuring that knowledge was accessible to local leaders and officials. This approach created continuity, institutional memory, and a cadre of educated personnel capable of sustaining the kingdom's systems. Edward's campaigns gradually absorbed Viking territories. Mercia, previously fragmented, was brought under Wessex's influence. Northumbria remained partially autonomous, but submission was negotiated in exchange for protection and recognition. Hybrid governance emerged. Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian traditions were blended, accommodating local customs while asserting central authority. This pragmatic approach minimized disruption and allowed local populations to adapt without wholesale displacement. Aethelstan, Edward's son, would expand on this foundation. By the 930s, Aethelstan had consolidated control over much of England, including northern territories previously under Viking influence. His campaigns combined strategic warfare with diplomatic integration. Local lords were incorporated into royal administration. Viking leaders were offered lands and positions in exchange for allegiance. Through this combination of force, negotiation, and city-building, Aethelstan effectively unified England under a single crown. Coinage standardization was a key tool in Aethelstan's unification. Silver pennies were minted in multiple burhs across the kingdom, circulating widely and creating economic cohesion. Merchants, townspeople, and lords alike recognized the currency as legitimate, binding disparate regions into a single economic system. Trade thrived along rivers, coastal ports, and inland markets, reinforcing the perception and reality of unity. Law enforcement reinforced this cohesion. Assemblies across England applied consistent rules, resolving disputes and enforcing obligations. Compensation rates for injury or property loss were standardized. Legal precedent and royal oversight ensured that even distant communities were tied to central authority. Law became a practical instrument of governance, not merely a statement of moral or religious principle. Cultural integration was equally important. Place names, art, and material culture reflected a blending of Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian traditions. Marriages between settlers and locals created kinship networks that bound communities to the crown. Language evolved, incorporating Norse words and expressions, producing a vernacular capable of uniting diverse populations. Religion played a stabilizing role. Bishops and abbots mediated disputes, reinforced loyalty, and legitimized royal authority. The process of unification was deliberate and gradual. It was neither instantaneous nor absolute. Viking territories retained some autonomy, local customs persisted, and occasional rebellion tested the system. But over decades, integration deepened. The kingdom functioned as a coherent whole, capable of defending itself, administering justice, and sustaining trade and communication. By the end of the 10th century, England had emerged as a unified kingdom in both political and cultural terms. Wessex's administrative and military model, Alfred's burh network, and the integration of Viking territories created a functional and resilient state. Authority was both personal and systemic, rooted in loyalty but reinforced by institutions. The kingdom's identity was built through law, language, trade, and religion, rather than through conquest alone. The lessons of this century were clear. Unification is a slow process. Military victories create opportunity, but lasting cohesion requires law, administration, education, and cultural integration. England's emergence as a kingdom was the product of decades of strategy, reform, and adaptation. It was the cumulative effect of leaders who understood that survival, expansion, and cohesion depended on systems as much as strength. The island that had once been fragmented, repeatedly invaded, and culturally divided now possessed the foundations of centralized authority. The network of burhs, standardized law, integrated coinage, and educated administration ensured that the kingdom could endure future challenges. England's identity, nascent but tangible, began to solidify, bridging Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian cultures into a shared political and cultural framework. The next chapter would examine how this unified kingdom consolidated its power further, defended against external threats, and evolved into a recognizable nation. The slow, deliberate work of unification had begun, proving that enduring political authority requires systems, integration, and the careful alignment of military, legal, economic, and cultural tools. The year 1066 stands as a turning point in England's history. It is remembered as the year the Anglo-Saxon ruling elite fell, replaced by a Norman aristocracy. Yet the story is more nuanced than legend or popular imagination suggests. Power changed hands, but the people, the land, and much of the culture endured. The conquest was decisive, but it was not instantaneous. The crisis began with the death of Edward the Confessor in January 1066. Edward left no direct heir. The question of succession created a vacuum at the top of the English political system. Three men claimed legitimacy: Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex and England's most powerful noble; Harold Hardrada, King of Norway with a distant Viking claim; and William, Duke of Normandy, who asserted that Edward had promised him the crown years earlier. The stage was set for a struggle that would shape the future of England. Harold Godwinson, with deep roots in the English nobility, was crowned swiftly. He was an experienced leader, familiar with the land, the burhs, and the obligations of local lords. His claim reflected continuity. He represented the Anglo-Saxon system of kingship, loyalty, and obligation that had endured since Alfred the Great. Yet the succession dispute exposed the fragility of the system. Without a direct heir, personal loyalty and the support of leading earls determined legitimacy. England had survived fragmentation and invasion before, but the crown was vulnerable when dynastic lines were uncertain. Before Harold could consolidate power, threats arrived from both north and south. Harold Hardrada invaded from Norway, landing in the north with a formidable force. The English army marched quickly, relying on local levies and the burr network established centuries earlier. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson's forces decisively defeated the Norwegian king. The battle was brutal but demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of the Anglo-Saxon military system. Yet victory came at a cost. Harold's army had marched hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, exhausted from battle and unprepared for another challenge looming to the south. William of Normandy invaded shortly thereafter. Landing on the southern coast, William brought a disciplined, experienced force. Norman tactics differed from Anglo-Saxon methods. Where the English relied on shield walls and levies, the Normans combined cavalry, archers, and infantry in coordinated maneuvers. At Hastings, on October 14, 1066, these differences would prove decisive. The Battle of Hastings was not simply a clash of armies, it was a confrontation between two systems of warfare, two political cultures, and two visions of authority. The English shield wall held firm for much of the day, reflecting discipline and cohesion. The Normans feigned retreats, drew segments of the English army out of formation, and exploited gaps. Harold Godwinson was killed to counts, suggest an arrow struck his eye and the Anglo-Saxon command structure collapsed. Victory gave William the crown, but it did not erase the English population, their communities, or their institutions. Norman consolidation was deliberate. William understood that power required more than battlefield success. He constructed castles across strategic locations, Hastings, Dover, Winchester, and beyond. These fortifications were not only military outposts, they were centers of administration, symbols of authority, and tools for controlling potentially rebellious regions. The Maton-Bailey design allowed rapid construction and imposed a visual presence over the landscape, asserting control through architecture and logistics as much as force. The Normans implemented feudal structures, redistributing land to loyal followers. Anglo-Saxon earls were replaced by Norman lords. The governing elite shifted dramatically, and the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was largely extinguished. Yet the majority of the population, peasants, farmers, craftsmen, remained in place. Daily life continued, but under new obligations, taxes, and lords. The conquest reshaped power at the top, while leaving continuity at the base. Law and governance adapted. Normans integrated with existing systems, retaining many Anglo-Saxon practices while imposing new legal norms. Shires, hundreds, and burghs continued to function as administrative units. The king's writ extended through these structures. But with Norman appointees overseeing collection, justice, and local administration, in effect, the conquest layered a new elite over pre-existing systems rather than replacing them entirely. Economy and society evolved under the new regime. Agricultural practices remained largely unchanged, but obligations shifted. Taxes were now directed to Norman lords, and rents were enforced through new hierarchies. Trade continued along rivers and coastal ports, integrating England further into continental networks. The Norman presence connected England more directly to Europe, politically, militarily, and culturally. Cultural blending occurred gradually. Norman French became the language of the elite and court, but English remained the vernacular for most of the population. Place names, legal terms, and administrative vocabulary incorporated French influences over time. Architecture evolved. Stone keeps replaced wooden halls, cathedrals reflected continental styles, and urban centers began to expand in new patterns. Religion provided continuity. The church retained influence, mediating between rulers and people, while new Norman bishops and abbots reinforced loyalty to the crown. The conquest illustrates a critical historical principle. One battle changes power, not people overnight. While Hastings decisively ended Anglo-Saxon kingship, the population, the land, and daily life persisted. Norman authority was consolidated through infrastructure, law, and administrative integration rather than brute force alone. The system built by Alfred, Edward, and Athelstan burghs, assemblies, law codes, and literacy remained functional, providing a framework the Normans could adapt. The psychological impact of the conquest was profound. Anglo-Saxon identity persisted among common people. Customs, traditions, and language endured beneath the new elite. Over generations, this blending created a society that was neither purely Anglo-Saxon nor entirely Norman, but something distinctly English. Castles became symbols of this layered authority. Maton-Bailey fortifications allowed the Normans to project military power quickly across the countryside. They controlled trade routes, river crossings, and fertile plains. Administratively, each castle was a node of taxation, law enforcement, and surveillance. In this way, the conquest transformed not only political authority, but the physical landscape of England. Norman military tactics reshaped English warfare. Cavalry charges, coordinated archery, and siege techniques introduced new strategies. Anglo-Saxon shield walls, while effective, were vulnerable to these innovations. The integration of these tactics into English military practice would influence warfare for generations. Yet continuity persisted at the local level. Peasant communities continued farming, paying rents, and observing local customs. Markets operated as before, though profits now flowed to Norman lords. Churches remained centers of education, ritual, and dispute resolution, providing stability for ordinary people. The conquest reshaped power but did not obliterate society. By the end of the 11th century, England was transformed. The ruling elite was Norman. Administrative and military systems were reorganized. Law, taxation, and governance were adapted to serve new masters. But the foundations laid by centuries of Anglo-Saxon, Kings Alfred's, burrs, law codes, assemblies, and literacy remained intact. England had experienced a sudden change in power at the top, but its society evolved rather than collapsed. The lessons of 1066 are clear. Decisive battles can alter the course of authority, yet the survival and continuity of a people rely on underlying systems. Normans imposed their rule, but they inherited structures developed over centuries. English resilience, infrastructure, and governance provided the framework that made conquest possible and sustainable. The Norman conquest did not erase England, it transformed it. Power shifted rapidly, institutions adapted, and the population endured. The conquest was a turning point in authority, military strategy, and culture. But continuity persisted beneath the surface. The next chapter would examine how Norman rule consolidated authority, introduced new institutions, and integrated England into continental Europe. The slow evolution of society continued even under a dramatically altered elite. One battle had changed power, but the transformation of a kingdom unfolded over decades. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, was the defining moment of the Norman conquest. It was not simply a clash of armies, it was a confrontation between two political systems, two military traditions, and two visions of authority. Harold Godwinson's Anglo-Saxon army was composed largely of local levies, men who had defended their homes, their burghs, and their kin for generations. Discipline was maintained through loyalty to local lords and by personal ties to Harold himself. The shield wall, a dense line of interlocking shields, was the backbone of Anglo-Saxon defense. It was effective, tested by years of Viking raids, and capable of absorbing direct assaults. William of Normandy, by contrast, commanded a professional force trained in continental methods of warfare. Norman troops were organized into infantry, archers, and cavalry, each with specialized roles. The combination allowed for flexibility on the battlefield. Feigned retreats could draw opponents out of formation. Archers could weaken key positions, and cavalry could exploit openings swiftly. Norman discipline and coordination were unfamiliar to the English, who had relied on tightly packed infantry formations. The battle began with initial assaults on the shield wall, but the Anglo-Saxons held firm. For hours, William's infantry and archers pressed the line, sustaining repeated attacks with limited success. Norman casualties were heavy. William himself was injured, reportedly struck by a lance, yet he continued to direct his forces. The persistence of leadership contrasted sharply with the exhaustion and attrition that the Anglo-Saxons faced. Feigned retreats were the turning point. Norman forces pretended to flee, drawing portions of the English army out of formation. Once isolated, these men were surrounded and cut down. Gradually, the shield wall broke in sections. Harold Godwinson was killed. Accounts suggest an arrow struck his eye. With the king fallen, command collapsed. The English army disintegrated, leaving the field to the Normans. The immediate consequence was clear. William claimed the crown of England, yet conquest was only beginning. Victory on the battlefield did not automatically translate into control over a kingdom. England was a complex patchwork of towns, villages, and regions, each with established administrative systems, local leaders, and obligations. To govern effectively, William had to integrate his authority into existing structures rather than replace them wholesale. Castles became the cornerstone of Norman consolidation. Matanbailey fortifications were built rapidly across key locations. Hastings, Dover, Winchester, and London were reinforced or newly constructed. These castles served multiple purposes: military outposts to project force, administrative centers to collect taxes, and visual symbols of authority to deter rebellion. The Mata raised earthwork topped with a wooden or stone keep dominated the landscape, while the bailey provided space for garrison troops, supplies, and administrative functions. The network of castles allowed William to control movement, monitor trade routes, and secure fertile regions. Rivers, roads, and strategic high ground were incorporated into placement decisions. By imposing a physical presence across the kingdom, Norman authority could be felt even in regions where local populations remained culturally Anglo-Saxon. Administrative integration was equally critical. William retains many of the Anglo-Saxon systems. Shires, hundreds, burghs, and assemblies continued to function. Local officials were replaced with Normans loyal to the crown, but the framework remained familiar. This allowed governance to continue without interruption, reducing potential chaos while asserting new authority. Taxation was enforced systematically. The Doomsday Survey, conducted decades later, reflects the methodical approach begun immediately after conquest. Landholdings were recorded, obligations documented, and tribute to the crown secured. Economic control reinforced political authority, ensuring that power extended beyond castles and armies into daily life. Law was adapted rather than discarded. Normans introduced their own customs and legal norms, but they integrated Anglo-Saxon precedents. Courts continued to operate within shires and hundreds. Dispute resolution, compensation, and obligations to lords were maintained. Now, under Norman oversight, this continuity helped legitimize, rule, and reduced resistance among common people. Cultural blending was gradual but profound. Norman French became the language of the elite, law, and administration. English remained the vernacular of most of the population. Over time, French words and expressions merged into the evolving English language. Place names, architecture, legal terminology, and art reflected hybrid influences. Churches remained central, mediating disputes, maintaining literacy, and legitimizing authority, while new bishops and abbots introduced continental practices and connections. The social impact of conquest was layered. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was largely replaced, yet peasants, farmers, and townspeople continued their work. Daily life persisted under new lords. Agricultural practices remained largely unchanged. Markets and trade networks continued to function, though profits and rents were redirected to Norman authorities. In this way, power shifted at the top while continuity persisted among the population. Military innovation persisted under Norman rule. Cavalry, archery, and coordinated infantry tactics influenced English military organization. Local levies were sometimes incorporated into Norman campaigns. The Burr network, inherited from Anglo-Saxon times, continued to provide defensive depth and staging points. William's successors refined these systems, blending Norman and Anglo-Saxon practices to maintain control and respond to threats. Religious institutions played a stabilizing role. Monasteries, abbeys, and churches maintained education, recorded law, and provided continuity amid political change. The integration of Norman and Anglo-Saxon clerics created a network that supported governance, facilitated communication, and reinforced cultural cohesion. The conquest demonstrates a fundamental historical lesson. Decisive battles alter power, but societies persist through systems. William's victory at Hastings did not obliterate the English people or their institutions. Instead, it layered Norman authority onto existing frameworks of administration, law, military organization, and culture. The population adapted, and over generations, English identity incorporated new elements while retaining continuity. By the late 11th century, England was transformed. Norman lords controlled land and political authority. Castles dominated strategic locations. Law and taxation were integrated under the new regime. Yet, Anglo-Saxon structures, the Burr network, shires, local assemblies, and common law practices remained functional. The conquest reshaped power at the top but preserved the underlying systems that sustained the kingdom. The Norman conquest also established a pattern for England's relationship with continental Europe. Political and cultural ties were strengthened. French influence permeated administration, law, architecture, and aristocratic culture. Trade and diplomacy increasingly connected England to the continent, setting the stage for future political developments. The Battle of Hastings, the castles, and the administrative reforms illustrate that conquest is a process, not a single event. One battle may determine succession, but lasting authority requires integration, infrastructure, law, and adaptation. William's success was not merely martial, it was systemic, building upon centuries of Anglo-Saxon organization, institutions, and culture. England survived, adapted, and evolved. Power changed rapidly, yet society endured. The Norman conquest reshaped the elite, introduced new military and administrative practices, and blended cultures. It did not erase continuity. It built upon it, creating a foundation for a kingdom capable of long-term governance, integration, and resilience. The next chapter would examine how Norman rule consolidated authority further, restructured governance, and transformed England into a medieval state that could project power, administer law, and manage an evolving economy. One battle had altered the crown, but the evolution of a kingdom unfolded over decades, reflecting the interplay of power, institutions, and the persistence of society itself. The conquest of 1066 had shifted the crown, replacing Anglo-Saxon rulers with Norman lords. But the battlefields were just the beginning. Winning the crown did not guarantee stable control over a diverse and often resistant population. William the Conqueror understood that power alone, wielded from the throne, was insufficient. To govern effectively, he needed a system that made authority tangible, enforceable, and continuous across time and space. Feudalism provided the solution. Under the feudal system, land became the primary instrument of power. William redistributed estates across the kingdom, granting vast tracts to loyal Norman followers. In exchange, these lords swore allegiance to the king, promising military support, counsel, and obedience. Land was no longer merely a source of wealth, it was a tool of governance. Control of territory equated to control of people, resources, and the means to project authority. The redistribution of land dramatically altered English society. Anglo-Saxon earls were largely displaced. Norman lords assumed positions of authority at local, regional, and national levels. Peasants continued to work the land, but their obligations shifted. Rents, labor duties, and military service were now directed to Norman lords. The continuity of daily life masked a profound transformation. England was being reorganized into a hierarchy of obligations that tied the king to his lords and the lords to their tenants. Castles became the most visible instrument of this new order. Matanbali designs were constructed rapidly across strategic locations. From the south coast to the Midlands and northward, these fortifications served multiple functions. They were military strongpoints, capable of repelling rebellion or invasion. They were administrative hubs from which lords could collect rents, adjudicate disputes, and oversee land management. They were symbols of power, dominating the landscape and reminding subjects that authority was present, organized, and enforceable. The design of these castles was deliberate. Moats-raised earthworks topped with wooden or stone keeps projected dominance across valleys, river crossings, and trade routes. Baileys enclosed living quarters, stables, and workshops, integrating military and civil functions. Castles were often sited near towns or villages, ensuring rapid control of both population and resources. Their construction reflected both military necessity and administrative foresight, creating a network of hubs capable of sustaining long-term control. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, represents the peak of Norman administrative innovation. This survey recorded every manor, village, and estate in England, detailing landholdings, resources, population, and obligations. It was unprecedented in scope, precision, and purpose. By documenting the kingdom systematically, William transformed abstract authority into recorded, enforceable power. Lords and peasants alike were accounted for. Disputes over land, rights, and taxes could now be adjudicated using records rather than memory or personal testimony. The Domesday Book exemplified the systematic nature of Norman governance. It integrated military, economic, and administrative functions. Landowners were accountable for their holdings. Taxes could be collected consistently. Military obligations were documented. Authority was no longer solely personal or charismatic. It was institutional, recorded, and enforceable. Feudal obligations extended from the king to his tenants-in-chief down to knights and peasants. Lords held land on the condition of service, military support, financial tribute, and loyalty. Knights, often drawn from the same landholding structure, owed both military service and adherence to local law. Peasants, villeins, borders, and serfs provided labor, produce, and obedience, sustaining the economic and military structures above them. Each layer of society was linked in a network of obligations, creating a system in which authority flowed downward and accountability flowed upward. Law and justice were central to this structure. Norman lords exercised authority within their domains, holding courts to adjudicate disputes among tenants. Shire courts and hundreds continued to function, now overseen by Norman officials. Customary law blended with Norman principles, creating a hybrid system that enforced obligations while maintaining familiar structures for the population. Loyalty, obedience, and compliance were enforced through both law and the visible presence of castles. The economic system reinforced the feudal hierarchy. Agricultural production sustained both peasants and lords. Markets within towns and burghs allowed trade to flourish. Now, under the oversight of Norman authority, taxes and rents were collected regularly, supporting military obligations and royal administration. The integration of economic, military, and administrative functions ensured that power was tangible and enforceable at every level. Cultural and linguistic change accompanied these structural reforms. Norman French became the language of the elite, law, and administration. English remained the vernacular, spoken by the majority of the population. Over decades, the languages blended, producing legal, administrative, and social norms that reflected both traditions. Architecture evolved. Stone keeps replaced wooden halls. Cathedrals were rebuilt in continental styles, and towns expanded around administrative centers. The Norman presence reshaped England physically, socially, and culturally, while leaving everyday life largely continuous for the population. Religious institutions were central to the feudal order. Churches and monasteries maintained literacy, mediated disputes, and reinforced loyalty to the crown. Norman bishops were appointed to key positions, but local clerics continued to serve communities. The church became both a stabilizing force and a tool for governance, linking spiritual authority to the secular hierarchy. Resistance to Norman rule existed but was often regional and episodic. Rebellions in the north and west were met with military suppression, fortification, construction, and systematic resettlement. William's methods combined force, administration, and symbolic presence. Castles, recorded obligations, and feudal hierarchies ensured that rebellion was risky, costly, and ultimately unsustainable. The transformation of England under Norman rule demonstrates a fundamental principle. Authority is sustainable when it is structured, recorded, and enforced. Military victory established the crown, but stability depended on integration, administration, and systemic accountability. Feudalism provided the framework. Castles projected power. The Doomsday Book recorded obligations. Law and economic structures reinforced the hierarchy. Together, these elements created a kingdom in which authority was visible, verifiable, and enforceable. By the end of the 11th century, England had become a kingdom of layered authority. The king commanded loyalty from lords. Lords commanded service from knights and tenants. Peasants provided labor and produce. Sustaining the system, castles and administrative structures ensured control. Law, custom, and record-keeping allowed power to extend across space and time. England's transformation was not total. The population persisted. Daily life continued, adapted, and integrated with new obligations. Customs, language, and local identities endured, blended with the Norman overlay. The conquest reshaped power and governance. But it did so by building upon existing systems rather than replacing society entirely. The lessons of this period are clear. Power is most durable when it is structured, recorded, and enforceable. Victory alone does not secure authority. It is the combination of military presence, administrative organization, law, and cultural integration that ensures long-term control. Norman rule created a template for England that would endure for centuries. Feudal hierarchies, castles, written records, and administrative oversight became the backbone of governance. Society adapted, integrated, and persisted beneath this new elite. The conquest reshaped the kingdom, but continuity provided the foundation for survival. The next chapter would explore the maturation of this system under subsequent monarchs, the evolution of law and governance, and the further integration of England into continental Europe. The story of Norman Britain demonstrates that lasting authority is not achieved by force alone. It is built through structure, documentation, and enforceable obligations, creating a society capable of enduring and adapting over time. The Norman conquest had established a new elite, but governing England required far more than replacing Anglo-Saxon lords. William and his successors faced a patchwork kingdom with regions of resistance, varied local customs, and a population largely unchanged in daily life. To assert control effectively, the Normans combined architecture, law, and administration into a cohesive system. At the center of this system were castles, burghs, and a detailed record of land and obligations. Castles were not evenly distributed, they were deliberate instruments of control, sited to dominate key areas. In the north, near York, castles oversaw the Danelaw heartland, ensuring Norman authority reached territories with long-standing Viking influence. In the Midlands, castles at Nottingham and Warwick controlled river crossings, trade routes, and fertile agricultural zones. Along the south coast, Dover and Hastings anchored defensive networks, projecting power toward continental Europe. Each castle acted as both a military strongpoint and an administrative hub, linking the king's authority to local communities. The motte and bailey design allowed rapid construction and immediate functionality. The motte, a raised earthwork topped with a wooden or stone keep, symbolized dominance and served as a defensive retreat. The bailey contained garrisons, storage, workshops, and sometimes a small civilian settlement. These fortifications allowed Norman lords to exercise military, administrative, and judicial control simultaneously. The visual presence of a castle was as significant as its physical capabilities. It reminded the local population that authority was both present and organized. The Doomsday Book amplified this control, providing a comprehensive snapshot of land, resources, and obligations. Compiled in 1086, it recorded every manor, village, and estate in England. It documented who held the land, how it was used, its value, and the obligations owed to the crown. From East Anglia to Cornwall, the Doomsday Survey transformed abstract authority into a system of enforceable rights and duties. One example from the Doomsday Book illustrates the scope of Norman administration. In Lincolnshire, manors previously held by Anglo-Saxon lords were granted to Norman tenants-in-chief. Each manor's population, plough teams, livestock, and woodland resources were recorded. Taxes and military obligations were clearly enumerated. This level of detail allowed the crown to extract revenue, enforce loyalty, and plan military campaigns with unprecedented precision. Similar surveys across England created a unified understanding of resources and responsibilities, linking disparate regions into a coherent system. Feudal obligations structured society from the top down. Lords held land from the king in exchange for military service and loyalty. Knights, often drawn from these landholdings, provided armed service, fulfilling both local and national defense needs. Peasants, villeins, borders, and cotters provided labor, produce, and compliance with the local lord's directives. Each tier was connected by clear obligations, ensuring that the crown's authority reached even the most remote villages. Local law was adapted to reinforce this structure. Shire courts and hundred courts continued to function, now overseen by Norman officials. Dispute resolution, compensation, and enforcement of obligations were maintained systematically. Norman lords introduced some continental practices, such as written charters and enhanced record-keeping, but customary Anglo-Saxon law persisted among the population. This blending of systems created legitimacy. Continuity reassured the population, while Norman innovations enforced the new hierarchy. Military obligations were formalized through the feudal network. Knights held land in exchange for service, providing the crown with a ready pool of armed men. Burhs and castles served as staging points for mustering forces. Peasants supported this system indirectly through labor and produce, sustaining both the garrison castles and local levies. The Norman approach integrated economic, administrative, and military control into a single, enforceable structure. Economy and taxation were intertwined with administration. Markets within towns and burhs expanded under Norman oversight. Trade along rivers, coasts, and roads was regulated, generating revenue for both the crown and local lords. Agricultural production continued, but obligations shifted. Rents and labor services flowed to Norman landlords rather than Anglo-Saxon earls. This ensured that economic activity reinforced political authority, linking the livelihood of communities to the system of governance. Cultural integration proceeded alongside administration. Norman French became the language of the court, law, and elite communication. English remained the vernacular, spoken by the majority of the population. Over decades, a hybrid linguistic system emerged, influencing legal terminology, administrative practices, and cultural expression. Place names were adapted. Castles introduced continental architectural styles, and urban centers expanded around administrative hubs. Religion reinforced this integration. Churches, monasteries, and cathedrals maintained literacy, mediated disputes, and provided moral legitimacy for Norman rule. New Norman bishops were installed, yet local clergy continued to serve communities. The church became both a stabilizing institution and an instrument of governance, linking spiritual authority to secular obligations. Resistance persisted in some regions. The north, particularly Yorkshire, witnessed periodic rebellions, often fueled by lingering Anglo-Saxon loyalty or Viking heritage. William responded with force, strategic castle construction, and resettlement policies. For example, the harrying of the north in 1069-70 involved the systematic destruction of villages and crops to prevent future uprisings, demonstrating the extreme measures sometimes required to enforce authority. Yet these measures were targeted, designed to secure long-term compliance without destabilizing the entire kingdom. Norman rule transformed the landscape both physically and socially. Castles reshaped topography. Administrative divisions imposed new order on villages and towns. Economic activity was redirected to support obligations. Law, taxation, and military service were integrated. The kingdom became structured, recorded, and enforceable in ways that Anglo-Saxon rulers had only begun to achieve. By the end of the 11th century, England had become a kingdom of layered authority. Power flowed from the king to lords, from lords to knights, and from knights to peasants. Castles served as both military and administrative centers. The Domesday Book ensured that land, resources, and obligations were clearly documented. Law and custom blended to provide legitimacy. The Norman system created stability and resilience, transforming England into a kingdom capable of sustained governance. Yet continuity persisted beneath the surface. The majority of the population, farmers, craftsmen, and townspeople, continued their daily lives. Agricultural practices, local markets, and community customs endured. English identity, language, and traditions persisted alongside the imposed Norman structures. The conquest had reshaped power at the top, but society remained functional, adaptable, and continuous. The lessons of this period are clear. Authority is durable when it is structured, recorded, and enforced. Military victories secure crowns, but administration sustains kingdoms. Castles, written records, law, taxation, and feudal obligations ensured that Norman rule was not temporary but enduring. England had been transformed, yet it had not been destroyed. The next chapter would examine how this feudal system matured under successive monarchs, how governance, law, and military obligations evolved, and how England integrated further into the political and economic networks of medieval Europe. Power had become structured, recorded, and enforceable, a system that would shape English society for centuries. The world of medieval England in the 12th and 13th centuries was far from the chaos and darkness often imagined. Daily life was structured, measured, and deeply influenced by systems that had evolved over centuries. The church, towns, and manorial institutions provided frameworks that gave rhythm and stability to society. Even amid war, famine, and political upheaval, medieval life was neither free nor easy, but it was organized, predictable, and resilient. The church dominated the spiritual, social, and even political life of medieval England. Every village had a parish church, where priests administered sacraments, instructed the young, and mediated disputes. Monasteries and abbeys served as centers of literacy, record-keeping, and education. Clerics documented property rights, witnessed charters, and advised lords on legal matters. Through preaching, ritual, and guidance, the church shaped daily behavior and reinforced moral, social, and political hierarchies. Beyond spiritual oversight, the church influenced practical life. Feasts, holy days, and liturgical calendars provided the population with a structure for work, rest, and celebration. Monastic institutions often controlled significant agricultural land, employing peasants and organizing production. Charitable functions, such as hospitals and OAM's distribution, reinforced the church's role as a stabilizing force. In short, the church was both moral authority and economic actor, binding society together in tangible ways. Towns expanded dramatically during this period. Trade routes, previously limited to local markets, extended across regions. River transport, ports, and overland roads connected towns to continental Europe, facilitating commerce in wool, grain, cloth, and imported goods. Markets were regulated spaces, often chartered by the king or local lord, with clearly defined days and legal oversight. Guilds emerged to organize trades and crafts, ensuring quality, controlling apprenticeships, and regulating prices. Guilds played a critical role in urban life. Blacksmiths, weavers, bakers, and merchants maintained strict codes of practice. Apprenticeships structured labor, training a generation in specific skills while reinforcing social hierarchies. Guild halls became centers of civic and economic organization, hosting meetings, arbitration, and festivals. Through guilds, townspeople exercised autonomy while remaining tied to overarching political and economic systems. Manorial life, by contrast, structured rural existence. Manors were the foundation of feudal society, integrating peasants, labor, and local administration. Villeins, boarders, cotters, and serfs worked the lord's land, fulfilling obligations of labor, produce, and rent. The domain, the lord's direct land, was farmed systematically, while peasant holdings supported subsistence and local obligations. Work followed the seasons, plowing in spring, sowing in early summer, harvesting in autumn. Communal activities, such as mowing meadows or harvesting grain, reinforced social cohesion and the structured nature of labor. Peasants' lives were regulated by custom and law. Manorial courts enforced obligations, resolved disputes, and imposed fines. Attendance at court was expected, and decisions were binding within the community. Disputes over boundaries, livestock, or labor were settled locally, often involving witnesses and documentation maintained by the manor clerk or reeve. This system ensured order at the local level, preventing minor conflicts from escalating into disorder. Markets connected rural and urban economies. Surplus produce from manors was sold or exchanged in market towns. Merchants, traders, and itinerant craftsmen linked villages to larger regional networks. Markets operated under the authority of lords or town charters, with rules governing weights, measures, and trading practices. This integration of local production and regional commerce stabilized the economy and provided predictability for both peasants and townspeople. Law courts extended beyond manorial jurisdiction. Shire courts, hundred courts, and the king's courts handled more serious disputes, criminal offenses, and issues of inheritance. Written records, increasingly common by the 13th century, documented judgments and obligations. Legal processes were accessible, structured, and enforced, contributing to an ordered society. Even in a world prone to violence and unrest, law created predictability and legitimacy. Education, literacy, and record-keeping, often centered in religious institutions, reinforced this order. Monasteries preserved charters, genealogies, and administrative documents. Clerics taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to those destined for church or administrative service. Records of landholdings, rents, and obligations ensured that obligations were enforceable and disputes resolvable. Knowledge, preserved in writing, gave structure to society and bridged generations. Social obligations were integral to order. Peasants owed labor, produce, and loyalty to their lord. Knights owed military service. Merchants owed dues to guilds and towns. The king and lords maintained authority through supervision, courts, and the collection of taxes or rents. Hierarchy, responsibility, and accountability were built into every aspect of life. Religious, economic, and legal structures intersected daily. Holy days determined the rhythm of work and worship. Markets connected communities and regulated trade. Courts ensured justice, enforced obligations, and resolved disputes. Guilds trained workers, maintained standards, and organized urban life. Manorial systems regulated land use, labor, and production. Together, these systems created an ordered, functioning society capable of enduring challenges. Despite wars, famines, and occasional rebellion, medieval life was organized. Villages followed the cycle of agriculture. Towns followed markets and guild regulations. Churches followed liturgical calendars. Courts, both manorial and royal, enforced law. Power was layered and structured, not arbitrary. Order did not eliminate hardship, but it created predictability, resilience, and continuity. Cultural life flourished within these structures. Religious festivals, fairs, and communal labor provided rhythm and cohesion. Architecture, from parish churches to guild halls, reflected both practical and symbolic order. Literacy and record-keeping preserved knowledge and reinforced authority. Social hierarchy structured obligations, ensuring that individuals understood their place within a broader system. By the 13th century, England had become a society where authority, labor, and daily life were interwoven. Power flowed from king to baron, from baron to lord, from lord to peasant. Church, town, and manor provided overlapping networks of control, guidance, and social cohesion. Order emerged not through absence of conflict, but through systems that anticipated, regulated, and mitigated human behavior. Medieval life was therefore highly structured. Peasants, knights, merchants, and clerics all operated within a framework of obligations and rights. Markets, guilds, courts, and manorial systems integrated daily life. Religion guided morality, labor, and social cohesion. Education and literacy ensured continuity and enforceability of law. Even in a world shaped by war and conquest, order was pervasive and enduring. The lesson of this period is clear. Medieval life was not chaotic. It was organized. Authority, labor, and economy were embedded in systems that structured society. The church, towns, and manors provided overlapping frameworks that ensured continuity, stability, and predictability. Order was visible in the architecture of towns, the scheduling of markets, the rulings of courts, and the rhythm of agricultural labor. The next chapter would examine the consolidation of royal authority, the emergence of parliamentary structures, and the evolution of law and governance in late medieval England. The foundations of order established through church, town, and manor would underpin centuries of English society. Medieval life, though demanding, was structured, resilient, and deeply interconnected, proving that systems, not merely rulers or battles, shaped the course of history. By the late 12th century, towns were no longer minor clusters of huts and markets. They had become centers of economic, social, and administrative life. York, Lincoln, and London expanded steadily, drawing rural populations into more permanent urban settlements. The growth of trade required infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, and marketplaces. Rivers such as the Thames and Severn became vital arteries for commerce, linking inland towns with continental markets. Market days were highly regulated. Lords granted charters defining when markets could be held, who could trade, and what goods could be sold. Weights and measures were standardized locally, enforced by appointed officials, ensuring fairness and predictability. Violations were met with fines, confiscation, or temporary bans, demonstrating that the economic order was intertwined with legal enforcement. Merchants and traders operated under a web of obligations, paying dues to the crown, to town authorities, or to guilds. Guilds structured trades and crafts within towns. Membership was essential to operate legally. Blacksmiths, weavers, bakers, and masons organized themselves hierarchically: masters, journeymen, and apprentices. Apprenticeships lasted years, during which young men learned the trade, obeyed guild rules, and contributed labor without pay. Journeymen traveled between towns, spreading skills and knowledge, while masters oversaw production quality and pricing. Guilds also provided social functions, mutual aid for widows and orphans, collective defense of trade interests, and communal religious observances. The church and guilds often intersected. Guild chapels were common, where members prayed collectively, celebrated feast days, and made offerings. Religious patronage reinforced civic cohesion. The intertwining of faith, labor, and economic life created an environment in which towns were not chaotic, but highly structured, predictable, and self-regulating. Manorial life remained the backbone of rural England. Most people still lived on manors, working fields, tending animals, and fulfilling labor obligations to local lords. These obligations were clearly defined: specific days of plowing, harvesting, and maintenance of infrastructure like roads and bridges. Peasants were bound by tenure, but not slaves in the absolute sense. They possessed land for their own subsistence and were entitled to protection. Justice and rights within the manorial court. Manorial courts were critical in maintaining order. The reeve, elected or appointed from among peasants, supervised labor and collected rents. The steward or bailiff represented the lord, presiding over disputes, imposing fines, and ensuring obligations were met. Issues ranged from boundary disagreements to theft or failure to provide labor. Documentation was increasingly used to confirm obligations, recording transactions, rents, and decisions. The combination of local knowledge, customary law, and enforceable judgments created a system in which rural society operated predictably. The interplay between manors and towns was dynamic. Villagers brought surplus produce to market towns, where merchants sold grain, wool, and livestock. Towns relied on this steady supply, and in return, offered specialized goods, tools, and imported luxury items. Economic interdependence encouraged regulation and oversight. Both lords and towns sought stability to ensure consistent production and trade. Markets thus became extensions of manorial and feudal order, rather than chaotic centers of exchange. Religion was woven into every aspect of life. Parish churches were daily focal points. Sacraments, baptisms, weddings, and funerals marked the life cycle. Monasteries, abbeys, and priories were centers of learning, producing manuscripts, educating clergy, and maintaining records of land and legal rights. The church mediated disputes, provided charity, and offered guidance in moral and practical matters. Its authority reinforced secular governance. Obedience to the Lord was mirrored by obedience to the church, creating overlapping layers of social control. Legal development further enhanced order. Royal courts were expanding, asserting authority over serious criminal cases and disputes involving substantial property. The king's justices traveled on circuits, hearing cases in towns and shires, applying common principles while respecting local custom. Manorial courts handled day-to-day issues, while guilds resolved trade disputes. This multi-tiered legal system ensured that conflicts were addressed at the appropriate level, maintaining societal stability. Education and literacy, though limited to clergy, lords, and some merchants, played an important role. Clerks maintained records of rents, obligations, and legal proceedings. Monastic schools preserved learning and facilitated administration. This literate elite enabled the enforcement of law, the functioning of markets, and the management of towns and manors. Even basic record-keeping created continuity, preventing disputes from escalating and ensuring obligations were met over generations. Cultural life flourished within this ordered framework. Festivals punctuated the agricultural calendar, celebrating sowing, harvest, or religious observances. Fairs brought peasants, merchants, and artisans together, blending economic and social activity. Architecture, from parish churches to guild halls and marketplaces, reflected the ordered structure of daily life, with specific spaces designated for worship, commerce, and assembly. Peasant life, though labor-intensive, was predictable. Seasons dictated work, obligations were clearly defined, and social networks provided support. Communal labor, such as shared plowing or haymaking, reinforced cooperation and social cohesion. Village councils or meetings mediated disputes and ensured collective responsibilities were met. The hierarchy of lord, steward, reeve, and tenant created clarity in expectations and responsibilities. By the end of the 13th century, England had developed a highly organized society. Power was layered. Kings, barons, lords, guilds, and clerics each exercised authority within defined spheres. Daily life was guided by obligations, religious practice, economic necessity, and legal oversight. The church, towns, and manors provided a network of systems that structured society, creating predictability even in an era often remembered for war, famine, and political tension. This structured society allowed for growth, resilience, and adaptation. Economic networks expanded trade, feeding urban centers and supporting rural production. Legal systems enforced obligations and mediated conflict. Guilds and the church maintained social cohesion, education, and morality. Castles and manorial hierarchies ensured the enforcement of power. Medieval life, when seen through this lens, was ordered, purposeful, and integrated. The daily rhythms of peasants, merchants, and clerics were connected to larger structures of authority, economy, and faith. What might appear as chaos from a distance was, in fact, a carefully balanced system in which obligations, rights, and institutions ensured continuity and stability. The lesson of this period is clear. Society is structured not only by rulers, but by overlapping networks of authority, faith, economy, and custom. Order emerges when systems regulate daily life, enforce obligations, and mediate conflicts. England, in the 12th and 13th centuries, exemplifies this principle. Power was embedded in church, town, and manor, creating a society capable of enduring challenges, integrating diverse populations, and sustaining continuity over generations. The next chapter would explore how these structures evolved under increasing royal authority, the emergence of representative institutions, and the growing tension between crown, barons, and towns that would shape late medieval England. Medieval life was not chaotic. It was deliberate, interconnected, and remarkably resilient. Order, once established, endured, providing the foundation for the centuries to come. England in the 14th century was a kingdom under pressure. For centuries, the rhythms of life had been regulated by feudal obligations, manorial courts, church authority, and town charters. Peasants and townspeople followed predictable patterns of labor, tribute, and worship. But the mid-14th century brought disaster of a scale that would shake these structures to their foundations. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348, carried by ships from continental Europe. Its spread was swift and indiscriminate. Villages were emptied, towns depopulated, and monasteries left abandoned. Between one-third and one-half of the population perished within a few years. Entire manors were left without laborers. Fields went untilled, markets slowed, and the very mechanisms of feudal society faltered. The consequences of demographic collapse were profound. With labor scarce, peasants found themselves in a position of unprecedented leverage. Lords, desperate to maintain production on their lands, were forced to offer better terms. Wages rose, rents could be negotiated, and some serfs were able to move to more favorable manors. The balance of power, previously fixed by obligation and tenure, began to shift incrementally toward the lower strata of society. The labor shortage prompted legal responses. The Statute of Laborers, enacted in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict movement of workers, yet enforcement was inconsistent. Local communities, guilds, and manorial officials found compliance difficult. Peasants, aware of their newfound scarcity, resisted restrictions, often negotiating better conditions or simply fleeing to regions with more favorable opportunities. The Black Death thus destabilized traditional systems, revealing both the fragility and adaptability of medieval society. Social unrest emerged in response to these shifts. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the most dramatic expression of labor and social grievances. Sparked by the imposition of a poll tax in resentment of oppressive labor restrictions, rebels marched from Kent and Essex toward London. They sought redress for centuries of economic exploitation and feudal obligation. Although ultimately suppressed by force, the revolt revealed the potential of ordinary people to challenge the established order. It marked a turning point. The balance of power had begun to tilt, however subtly, toward the working population. Towns benefited from these changes. With rural labor scarce, urban centers attracted workers with higher wages, economic opportunity, and relative freedom from manorial obligations. Markets expanded, trade increased, and guilds grew in importance, regulating production, training skilled labor, and maintaining order within towns. The economic vitality of urban centers began to rival, and in some cases surpass, the traditional power of rural manors. Feudal control itself began to erode. Lords, once able to dictate labor, rents, and obligations, faced constraints imposed by demographics, economic necessity, and social pressure. Tenants increasingly negotiated terms, paid in cash rather than labor, and sought mobility where possible. The rigid hierarchy that had defined medieval life for centuries began to flex. Power was still exercised from the top, but the top could no longer ignore the leverage of the ordinary population. Church influence persisted, but even religious authority was affected. With clergy and monastic populations reduced by plague, many parishes were left with untrained or absent priests. Monastic institutions, dependent on labor and donations, struggled to maintain estates and charitable functions. The church attempted to mediate disputes, offer moral guidance, and maintain social cohesion, but it too was forced to adapt to a society in flux. Agricultural practices shifted as well. Landowners, facing a scarcity of labor, moved toward pasture and sheep farming, which required fewer workers and provided valuable wool for trade. Crop rotations, field management, and estate planning changed in response to new economic realities. This altered the rural landscape, creating a more market-oriented approach to agriculture rather than one purely based on feudal obligation. The rise of wages reshaped social mobility. Skilled laborers could demand higher pay. Artisans moved between towns, and enterprising peasants acquired small plots or leases in exchange for money rather than labor. Guilds, towns, and markets became mechanisms for social and economic advancement. Although nobles retained political dominance, the everyday lives of ordinary people were no longer entirely constrained by inherited status. The period also witnessed a subtle transformation in governance. Kings, lords, and local officials had to consider the impact of population loss and labor unrest on taxation, military service, and administration. Royal courts expanded their oversight, seeking to regulate disputes and enforce laws across a changing social landscape. Local governance adapted to demographic shifts, balancing enforcement with the necessity of maintaining productive communities. Education and literacy, concentrated in towns and religious institutions, gained importance. Clerks, scribes, and merchants maintained records of transactions, obligations, and contracts. The ability to document agreements became a critical tool in an era where mobility and negotiation challenged traditional hierarchies. Written records allowed lords to enforce claims and peasants to assert rights, creating a more structured society despite the chaos of the plague. The Black Death and its aftermath accelerated long-term economic and social changes. Population decline transformed the balance of labor and capital. Markets expanded into previously underdeveloped regions. Towns emerged as centers of opportunity, governance, and culture. Peasants gained leverage, negotiating better conditions and challenging feudal norms. Guilds consolidated control over trades and production, stabilizing urban economies. Culturally, society adapted to mortality and uncertainty. Art, literature, and religious observance reflected awareness of death and social fragility. Communities commemorated the deceased, reinforced social cohesion, and sought order amid devastation. The Black Death did not annihilate medieval society. It reshaped the foundations of authority, labor, and economy. By the late 15th century, England had emerged transformed. Feudal hierarchies persisted, but they were less rigid. Peasants and townspeople exercised greater influence in economic life. Towns flourished as centers of trade, production, and governance. The church remained influential, though its authority had been tested and adapted. Society was simultaneously resilient and flexible, structured yet responsive to crisis. The lesson of this period is clear. Disaster can redistribute power. The Black Death, revolts, and economic shifts gave ordinary people leverage they had never possessed before. Authority persisted, but it had to negotiate with the realities of labor scarcity, economic necessity, and social mobility. England's society, once dominated by rigid feudal obligations, had begun to evolve into a more dynamic, interconnected, and flexible system. The next chapter would explore the consolidation of this social, economic, and political evolution in late medieval England, the rise of stronger monarchies, the growth of parliamentary institutions, and the development of law and governance that integrated towns, lords, and peasants into a more cohesive kingdom. Disaster had shaken the foundations, but from the upheaval emerged opportunity, resilience, and the early seeds of social change that would shape England for centuries. The devastation of the Black Death did not fall evenly across England. The lesson of this period is clear. Medieval life was not chaotic, it was organized. Authority, labor, and economy were embedded in systems that structured society. The church, towns, and manors provided overlapping frameworks that ensured continuity, stability, and predictability. Order was visible in the architecture of towns, the scheduling of markets, the rulings of courts, and the rhythm of agricultural labor. The next chapter would examine the consolidation of royal authority, the emergence of parliamentary structures, and the evolution of law and governance in late medieval England. The foundations of order established through church, town, and manor would underpin centuries of English society. Medieval life, though demanding, was structured, resilient, and deeply interconnected, proving that systems, not merely rulers or battles, shaped the course of history. By the late 12th century, towns were no longer minor clusters of huts and markets. They had become centers of economic, social, and administrative life. York, Lincoln, and London expanded steadily, drawing rural populations into more permanent urban settlements. The growth of trade required infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, and marketplaces. Rivers such as the Thames and Severn became vital arteries for commerce, linking inland towns with continental markets. Market days were highly regulated. Lords granted charters defining when markets could be held, who could trade, and what goods could be sold. Weights and measures were standardized locally, enforced by appointed officials, ensuring fairness and predictability. Violations were met with fines, confiscation, or temporary bans, demonstrating that the economic order was intertwined with legal enforcement. Merchants and traders operated under a web of obligations, paying dues to the crown, to town authorities, or to guilds. Guilds structured trades and crafts within towns. Membership was essential to operate legally. Blacksmiths, weavers, bakers, and masons organized themselves hierarchically: masters, journeymen, and apprentices. Apprenticeships lasted years, during which young men learned the trade, obeyed guild rules, and contributed labor without pay. Journeymen traveled between towns, spreading skills and knowledge, while masters oversaw production quality and pricing. Guilds also provided social functions, mutual aid for widows and orphans, collective defense of trade interests, and communal religious observances. The church and guilds often intersected. Guild chapels were common, where members prayed collectively, celebrated feast days, and made offerings. Religious patronage reinforced civic cohesion. The intertwining of faith, labor, and economic life created an environment in which towns were not chaotic, but highly structured, predictable, and self-regulating. Manorial life remained the backbone of rural England. Most people still lived on manors, working fields, tending animals, and fulfilling labor obligations to local lords. These obligations were clearly defined: specific days of plowing, harvesting, and maintenance of infrastructure like roads and bridges. Peasants were bound by tenure, but not slaves in the absolute sense. They possessed land for their own subsistence and were entitled to protection, justice, and rights within the manorial court. Manorial courts were critical in maintaining order. The reeve, elected or appointed from among peasants, supervised labor and collected rents. The steward or bailiff represented the lord, presiding over disputes, imposing fines, and ensuring obligations were met. Issues ranged from boundary disagreements to theft or failure to provide labor. Documentation was increasingly used to confirm obligations, recording transactions, rents, and decisions. The combination of local knowledge, customary law, and enforceable judgments created a system in which rural society operated predictably. The interplay between manors and towns was dynamic. Villagers brought surplus produce to market towns, where merchants sold grain, wool, and livestock. Towns relied on this steady supply, and in return, offered specialized goods, tools, and imported luxury items. Economic interdependence encouraged regulation and oversight. Both lords and towns sought stability to ensure consistent production and trade. Markets thus became extensions of manorial and feudal order, rather than chaotic centers of exchange. Religion was woven into every aspect of life. Parish churches were daily focal points. Sacraments, baptisms, weddings, and funerals marked the life cycle. Monasteries, abbeys, and priories were centers of learning, producing manuscripts, educating clergy, and maintaining records of land and legal rights. The church mediated disputes, provided charity, and offered guidance in moral and practical matters. Its authority reinforced secular governance. Obedience to the Lord was mirrored by obedience to the church, creating overlapping layers of social control. Legal development further enhanced order. Royal courts were expanding, asserting authority over serious criminal cases and disputes involving substantial property. The king's justices traveled on circuits, hearing cases in towns and shires, applying common principles while respecting local custom. Manorial courts handled day-to-day issues, while guilds resolved trade disputes. This multi-tiered legal system ensured that conflicts were addressed at the appropriate level, maintaining societal stability. Education and literacy, though limited to clergy, lords, and some merchants, played an important role. Clerks maintained records of rents, obligations, and legal proceedings. Monastic schools preserved learning and facilitated administration. This literate elite enabled the enforcement of law, the functioning of markets, and the management of towns and manors. Even basic record-keeping created continuity, preventing disputes from escalating and ensuring obligations were met over generations. Cultural life flourished within this ordered framework. Festivals punctuated the agricultural calendar, celebrating sowing, harvest, or religious observances. Fairs brought peasants, merchants, and artisans together, blending economic and social activity. Architecture, from parish churches to guild halls and marketplaces, reflected the ordered structure of daily life, with specific spaces designated for worship, commerce, and assembly. Peasant life, though labor-intensive, was predictable. Seasons dictated work, obligations were clearly defined, and social networks provided support. Communal labor, such as shared plowing or haymaking, reinforced cooperation and social cohesion. Village councils or meetings mediated disputes and ensured collective responsibilities were met. The hierarchy of lord, steward, reeve, and tenant created clarity in expectations and responsibilities. By the end of the 13th century, England had developed a highly organized society. Power was layered. Kings, barons, lords, guilds, and clerics each exercised authority within defined spheres. Daily life was guided by obligations, religious practice, economic necessity, and legal oversight. The church, towns, and manors provided a network of systems that structured society, creating predictability even in an era often remembered for war, famine, and political tension. The next chapter would examine how this emerging balance of power influenced late medieval England, the consolidation of royal authority, the growth of parliament, and the transformation of law and governance that integrated a more mobile, economically empowered population. Disaster had destabilized society, but it had also created opportunity. The ordinary people of England, through labor, negotiation, and adaptation, had reshaped the kingdom from the ground up, setting the stage for centuries of social, economic, and political evolution. As we reach the close of this journey through medieval Britain, one truth becomes clear. This was never a dead or stagnant age. Its towns, manors, churches, and markets were alive with structure and purpose. Its laws, institutions, and daily habits did not vanish with conquest, plague, or revolt. They endured. Pressure, crisis, and change forged resilience. Every castle, every guild, every parish acted as a link in a chain that would carry England into the modern world. Medieval Britain didn't survive because it was inherently strong. It survived because it adapted. It learned, restructured, and integrated change into the very fabric of society. Ordinary people, extraordinary systems, and the slow evolution of law and governance created a foundation that would shape the centuries to come. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, exploring the struggles, resilience, and ingenuity of medieval Britain, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Past Picture, to uncover more hidden histories from the past. Join us as we continue to explore how our world was shaped by the decisions, challenges, and adaptations of those who came before us. Medieval Britain teaches us this enduring lesson. Survival is never about brute strength alone. It is about adaptation, innovation, and the quiet persistence of society itself.